Okay, I think we're all set now.
We are
Great,
live.
thank you. Do we need to repeat any of the roll call stuff that we did?
No, we'll just
Okay.
note for the record the presence of Director Janine Stoughton-Covio and Vega.
Great, thank you. So first up on the SACOG agenda this morning is public communications. This is a time for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that does not appear on the agenda. And I do know I have one card, I believe, from Mr. Mandelkern.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so good morning. I was unsure whether or not to bring this subject up at this time or later because it's related to transit funding. The thing that it's related to several activities that have taken place in this room within the last 2 weeks and also yesterday. I'm glad that Leo invited us to this workshop. That's primarily why I'm here. The ending of the May 7th meeting, there was a very much concern about the dire state of this transit cliff that's going to be covered today. However, the mood yesterday in this very same room 24 hours ago was very upbeat. And it was happy, it was celebratory, it was very looking ahead. It was covering the CARTA, the group that is going to be implementing tolling lanes. My reason for bringing this up is that transit was spoken about yesterday to use those toll lanes, and the toll lanes were also covered in much depth. And the main reason behind them is the whole concept of generating revenue. So my reason for bringing this up is I wonder if it would be appropriate from this day forward to maybe talk a little bit more often about CARTA, what CARTA can bring us, to maybe take off the edge and the severity off the impending fiscal cliff, and if we could outright avoid it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any additional public comment?
There's no other public comment.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to ask about disclosures again related to SACOG. Is there any board member that has to disclose anything due to a conflict? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to consent agenda for the SACOG meeting. Anyone can remove an item for discussion or make a comment. Is there anyone that needs to remove an item or has a comment on the consent agenda?
Lauren moves consent.
Okay.
Second.
Oh, you got Baines got in with a second. Is there any public comment on the consent agenda?
There's no public comment on consent.
Okay, great. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Motion passes. Excellent. Okay, next we have a workshop. The May workshop is a deep dive on the transit fiscal cliff and lessons learned from peer regions. Morning, Leo.
Morning. Leo Torres, transportation analyst here at SACOG. We are excited this morning to have Dr. Philip Plotch with us, leading this workshop to provide broader national context on this important issue, the transit fiscal cliff, and build our collective understanding on the policy solutions and strategies that we can learn from peer regions that are also facing this issue. Dr. Plotch is a principal researcher and senior fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation, based in Washington, D.C., and he conducts policy research and analysis on a wide range of transportation issues. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Philip Plotch.
Good morning.
Thanks. Happy to be here today. So I put this slide up. I thought it might make you feel a little bit better knowing that Sacramento's experience with transit services and transit issues isn't all that much different from what's going on in the rest of the country. The history is pretty similar. If you go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, there were companies that built light rail lines, or streetcars, horse-drawn carriages on tracks here. Often they made a lot of money on real estate, these companies. You could buy up some farmland, lay down some tracks, and all of a sudden your land is so much more valuable. And then the people who live there and work there rely upon your services. It was a great way to make money. What happened over the next couple of decades is very different. Cars became more affordable. The streetcar companies And you can see there's in that previous slide, there was one from Sacramento. The streetcar companies couldn't make any more money. And the cities felt like they only had two choices. They could either eliminate all service, there'd be no service, or they could take it over. And after the Second World War, many cities like Sacramento created transit authorities. Sacramento's transit authority was created in 55. In the 60s, because of suburban growth, regional agencies were created, and that's RTD got created in 1973. In recent years, there's been sort of this expectation that people have when they travel, and a lot of it, I think, is based on GPS in your car or using ride sharing. We expect instant information. And people have higher expectations when it comes to traveling, when it comes to when is this light rail coming and when am I going to get to my destination? So there's a lot more attempts to integrate information in between agencies, having regional fare cards. You've been seeing that in the last 10 or 15 years. All right, so I have a question here. Here's a map of the United States. Anybody know what cities have transit agencies that make money? Any guesses here? No. Correct. This is a map of all the transit agencies that do not make any money. Not only do they not make money on their operating costs, they don't make enough money to pay off their debt from adding new lines or their capital programs of fixing up stations. They're all subsidized all over the country. So here's what I want to talk about today. Talk about some issues that come up around the country, some trends in ridership, talk about the revenue problem, the expense problem, talk about the death spiral, which you might have heard about before, then what some other regions are doing about the fiscal cliff, and then a few suggestions that I have for Sacramento. So we hear some similar problems and challenges around the country. First, it's money. Second is money. And third is money. It's like always money. Then is safety. And I felt it last night when I was thinking about taking the light rail line here. Sometimes you just don't feel comfortable waiting at a station or a bus stop. It might be a real concern, or it could just be a perception of safety. That comes up everywhere. And the third is coordination of information. When you have multiple transit agencies like you do here or in San Francisco, Bay Area, where there's like 27 different agencies, it can be really confusing when you have to go from one system to another system. There's a bunch of challenges we hear. It's hard to get Americans out of their cars. It's hard to get state legislators to address the problem. Sometimes the cities and suburbs are suspicious of each other. When transit advocates are trying to take money from the highway folks aren't so crazy about that. And then some transit agencies are just resistant to change. They've been doing things the same way over and over. All right, so these are Sacramento's peers. You think about like relatively new systems, growing regions, most of them west of the Rockies. But I want to talk also about some of the big cities because there's some really important lessons you can learn, things that they do right and things that they do wrong here today. All right, so just a quick background. I work at the Eno Center for Transportation. We're independent, we're nonpartisan, we're nonprofit, and we try to help out local transportation agencies and also keep track of what's going on at the national level when it comes to transportation. I've written a few books, mostly about transportation in the New York region. All right, so the second one, ridership trends. What's going on? So this is the number of bus trips that you can see have been taken in the United States going back to 2000. So you can see transit use is creeping up from the low point of the pandemic. The world has changed. I don't think we're going to be reaching that pre-pandemic level for a while. People don't like going to the office on Fridays. People don't like going to the office on Mondays. People don't like going to the office when it's raining or snowing or whatever it is, your kid's sick. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, transit was facing a problem. You could see it's sliding. Yeah. And this is really important to understand. It was sliding before the pandemic, even though the population and the employment numbers were going up in the United States. And one of the big reasons for that is ride sharing. So Uber and Lyft and these other systems, they started to take people away from transit systems. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? It's fast, it's easy, it's reliable, and it's relatively inexpensive. This is light rail. So you can see light rail was going up. One reason is because there's a lot of cities who have been building light rail. So it was going up, but then it's dropped down and come back, kind of like the buses. So This is, to me, a really interesting number. It shows you the city, the metro area, the state, and the United States of America are all kind of the same. This is, you're like this quintessential America, I suppose. Most people, when they go to work, this is how you get to work. Most people drive by themselves, right? 2/3 of the people drive by themselves. Carpool, you add another 10%. Transit's really small. So in the city, in the region, it's 2%. California, distorted a little bit by the Bay Area, is a little bit higher. The United States is distorted by some of the bigger cities, so that's a little bit higher. But for the most part, you're not all that dissimilar. And despite the high number of people that bicycle to work in this office here, it's a relatively low number of people biking and a relatively no people are walking. And you can see the number of people who work from home is about the same in the city, region, across the country. That's working from home. This is American Census data. They survey like 30,000 people every year. And this is the numbers that they got when they asked people how they get to work. Sometimes it could be a little confusing because you could take transit and then you could bike, or you could work from home sometimes and not sometimes. But it's the best numbers that we have to compare across regions. So very different across the country. So New York, half the people who live in New York City take transit. San Francisco's really high. San Francisco's number 2, Chicago's number 3. Sacramento is down with the rest of America using transit to get to work. This is just to work. And you can see how it changed between 2019 and 2024. You can see the percentage of people traveling to work by transit dropped after the pandemic in Sacramento, Austin, and all of these different peer cities. They all dropped, some more than others. This is work from home. You can see the blue is 2019, and the other color is, sorry, a little bit colorblind. The other color is 2024. And you can see the number of people who work from home just skyrocketed between 2019 and 2024. No surprise, but it's useful to know what's going on in Sacramento isn't all that much different than the rest of the country. All right, so the next one is the revenue problem. All right, so this shows you the base fare. So pretty much the lowest fare, not including youth fares or passes or senior fares. You can see Sacramento, $2.50 in 2019. So they're all between $1.25 and $3. And the next slide shows you what they would be if they went up at the rate of inflation. So if Sacramento every year had a sort of cost of living increase, at this point, the fare would be $3.23. You can see Minneapolis would have gone from $2 to $2.59, Portland, $2.50 to $3.23. So the next slide shows you what it is today, the actual number. You see, for the most part, it hasn't changed. Minneapolis is the same, hasn't kept up with inflation. Denver, they actually lowered the fare in 2024. Portland went up a little bit, but not at the rate of inflation. And Sacramento is still at $2.50. This is one of the reasons that transit agencies have a revenue problem, but actually not the biggest reason. All right, this shows you fare revenue 2019 to 2024 in millions of dollars. So you could see the drop in every single city in how much the transit agencies were collecting in fares. Okay, the next one is a decrease. To me, this is really dramatic, right? You're losing 50%, 40%, 30% of your fare revenue between pre-pandemic and 2024. And just so you know, we don't have the 2025 numbers that are consistent across the country, which is why we're sticking with the 2024. Federal funding for transit. So the federal government provides about $22 billion, that's with a B, every year to transit agencies. And these are some of the big programs. They have urbanized areas, including Sacramento. There's a formula that the federal government has and Congress has set up on how much it's going to get. Rural areas, they're sort of special. They get operating money. Almost all the money that goes to Sacramento is for capital money, for expansion or for improvement or new buses or new trains or fixing up stations. It's the rural areas that are getting the operating assistance. That's really important because when we talk about the fiscal cliff, we talk about an operating budget fiscal cliff, not a capital budget fiscal cliff. So you can see state of good repair. That's also capital. Bus and bus facilities is capital, capital investment, capital, right? So it's infrastructure and capital, very little for operating. But today, the House of Representatives, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is actually debating the reauthorization of federal legislation that's going to provide funding for the next 5 years. I don't know what's going to happen to this legislation, but this committee is debating it, and they'll probably vote on it in the next few days. And they might carve out this one exemption if you're a local transit agency and you have between 101 and 125 buses. Maybe you can use a portion of your funds for operating expenses. So I don't know if that means Sacramento RTD can split their service into two because they have 200 buses, but and I don't know understand why Congress does the things that they do sometimes.
Where's the chairman from and how many buses does his hometown have?
That is a really good question.
I've worked there. This is the deal.
So I think RTD has like 197 buses or something. Yeah. I don't know. But the congressional members know, right? Yeah. All right. So back to this operating thing. So I said it's $22 billion a year. Let's say 21 billion is for capital, and then there's planning and probably helping to pay for some of the MPO expenses here. So the virus hits, ridership is down, Congress steps in, and very, very generous to transit. They give $25 billion in March of 2020. They can use it for capital or operating. This is helping to supplement the budget of transit agencies all over the country. And then there's another one, December 2020, another $15 billion to transit. So think about it in that context of $22 billion a year for is the entire federal transit budget. March 2021, another $30 billion for transit. So the transit agencies have been using this money to pay their bills ever since. So it's a total of $70 billion. So you can see why transit agencies haven't necessarily had to cut service that much or raise fares during the pandemic, even though ridership had gone down. Some agencies stretched it out a little bit longer than others. All right, so the next one is the expense problem. We talked about the revenue problem. So at the same time, revenue is going down, operating expenses are going up. And this is just, if you think about the inflationary period we'd have in the past few years, it's not a surprise. So just so you know, these expenses include rail, it includes light rail, it includes heavy rail, it includes commuter rail, it also includes paratransit and on-demand services too. So this shows you in numbers, right, in millions of dollars or thousands of dollars. The next one shows you the percentage. So you could see 20% increase in Twin Cities, Austin, 60 to 70% increase. It's a big increase in expenses. All right, so I want to stop here for a second and make sure everybody understands this one. So there's a term called fare box recovery ratio. So it's a little math thing here. So it's the percentage of operating expenses that are generated by the fare. So that means if it costs you $1 to provide service, you're going to get, if it's a 10% ratio, you're only getting 10 cents in fare. So that means across the country in these peer cities you have, for every $1 it costs to provide service, you're collecting 20 cents, 15 cents, 30 cents in service. Very, very heavily subsidized all across the country. Everybody got this? Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to mention is something called the death spiral. And I think of it, and it happens with shopping malls too. So if you think about, you're the head of the transit agency and you're dealing with this problem of not enough riders, not enough money. One easy thing to do is cut service. If you cut service or if you raise fares too much, and that can happen also, you start to lose riders. And then you say, oh, we have fewer riders, we're going to cut service. And then you've cut service, you're going to have fewer riders. And then you have sort of this death spiral. You cut service, you lose riders, you cut service, you lose riders until there's no transit service at all. And I think of it not that different than some of the malls that we see around the country. The big store like a Macy's or Nordstrom's closes, and then fewer people go to the mall, and then Gap closes, right? And then fewer people go to the mall, and then the food court starts emptying out. Pretty soon you have a dead mall. So personally, I don't like dead malls, and I don't like dead transit services. Oh, a Pier City. All right. So you've heard the term transit fiscal cliff, and I just want to tell you, like, who is the most vulnerable to this? So this is it's just a selected group of relatively large cities here. So if you look at that fare box recovery before the pandemic, this shows you that BART, for every dollar that it cost them to provide service, it was getting 72 cents in fare, a really high number. And what's fascinating to me is that they're both in the same state. You go to the very bottom, you see LA Metro. For every dollar it cost them to provide service, they were collecting 15 cents in fares. So LA Metro was so much more heavily subsidized than BART. That means BART is going to be much more vulnerable when they start losing fares from losing riders. So there's a bunch of reasons why some are more vulnerable to this fiscal cliff than others. So if you relied on the fare, like BART, now some places ridership went down more than others because they lost population. So during the pandemic, a lot of people started moving out of the Bay Area. It's kind of expensive. They can go back home where it's cheaper. So they got hit pretty hard. Some places where you're more likely to work from home, again, the Bay Area, because there's a lot of these tech folks, so they could work from home. And then if you're an agency that just provides train service and not bus service, you're more likely to get hurt also. Again, why BART got hurt. And you're going to hear about them for a lot in the news if you keep your eyes open for it. BART got hurt because fewer people are taking the train than the buses. There's a difference if your opportunity to work from home, if you're sort of live in a well-off suburb and you're going into the center city, chances are you're making a lot more money, you work in an office, as opposed to people who live in a city who tend to work more service-oriented jobs and have to go into work. So BART got hurt really hard. And another reason it got hurt really hard is because it's really hard to cut expenses for rail. So RTD, it's easier to cut expenses for bus than rail because you have to pay for that right of way and maintain the right of way, and you have to clean up the stations and those cars. You're not going to be like eliminating any cars like you could eliminate buses pretty quickly. So RTD is having a bigger problem, I'm sure. I haven't talked to them, but trying to cut expenses on their rail versus their bus. So just want to explain now where transit agencies to get their money. They're not getting it from fares for the most part, right? So where's this money come from? And I want to mention the Bay Area and New York City, not because it's a great model, just because they do so many different things. So it's kind of interesting to see. So this is a chart, which is really complicated, and that's sort of the point of it. The point is, even within one region, there's so many different choices here. So you could see for San Francisco, all the way on the right, I circled top 2 sources by agency. So the San Francisco MTA, that's Muni, most of their money comes from the city general fund and then parking and citations. So you drive into San Francisco, you get a ticket. The Muni folks will definitely appreciate that, right? So BART, you can see is the fare box. You can see then there's sales tax and property taxes. There's bridge tolls, lots of different places where transit agencies get their money, even within one region. I'm a New Yorker or New Jersey person who pretends to live in New York. And I can tell you in New York, there's lots of places they're getting the money from also. They're getting most of the bridges are tolled within the city. There's real estate taxes. You take an Uber, there's a tax, the sales tax, there's a payroll tax if you live in the city, there's gas tax. People don't even realize that they're subsidizing so many things. So they're paying $9 or $10 when they go on, when they're taking a bridge for their toll. They don't realize the money's going to pay for transit. That's one of the things that legislators have been doing over the years, is taking money from here and there, so it's not a big hard hit that scares people. In New Jersey, there's a lot of money that comes from the Turnpike and Parkway. The Port Authority, you probably heard of JFK Airport, Kennedy Airport, Newark Airport. They help subsidize both the bus terminal in New York, as well as the PATH train that goes between New York and New Jersey. So again, lots of different sources of money. Okay, so next is, how are different folks addressing the fiscal cliff? One is you could pretend it's not there. I would not recommend that. So this is BART's deficit. You can see they are in big trouble, right? You could see big deficit is coming up, and they've known about it for a couple years, and they've been trying really hard to address it, which is why there is a ballot initiative in November. There's 2 ballot initiatives, and I think it's kind of interesting to think about sort of that regional perspective as well as the city perspective here. So there's going to be on the ballot a proposal for a regional sales tax, and it would increase the tax in 5 different counties. And another interesting thing I think to think about here is that it doesn't have to be the same across all the counties. So in the Sacramento region, just because you're taxing one part of the region doesn't mean the taxes have to be the same across the entire region. So in the in the Bay Area, 4 of the counties are going to would get an increase of 0.5% in the sales tax. San Francisco would get a 1% increase. And this would go to support regional transportation, like BART, also some from Muni too. And then there's the city proposal too, and this is a real estate tax, and that would just go for the MTA or Muni. All right. So agencies have not only been trying to get more money and get more riders when they can, but also they've been cutting back on services. So this shows you 2 different colors, bus and light rail. So bus is in blue and light rail is in red. And this shows you how cities across the country have been cutting back on services as a way to save money. So you can see, if you go to the bottom, you can see Sacramento cut their light rail by 17%. Their buses are increased. I'm not sure why. You'll have to ask RTD about that one. But you can see most cities have cut services for both bus and light rail. San Diego's a real outlier because they started up a new light rail line a few years ago. So this shows you one budget that I picked out just to get a sense of what's going on here. This is the Utah Transit Authority, covers most of the state. You can see their revenues from sales tax jumped 300 million to $500 million. And it wasn't necessarily just because of a tax increase. It was also because it's a region that's growing really fast. The population went from like 2 million to 2.4 million in just a few years. So a lot more sales tax coming in. And you could see that is where the bulk of the money is coming from, right? The passenger revenue, the fare revenue is relatively small compared to the sales tax. Now, again, thinking about when you look within a region, every county, every municipality doesn't have to contribute the same amount. There's a very complicated thing here. And I'm not even going to really talk about it except show you that there's a lot of colors about how different counties and municipalities within the region contribute a certain amount of money from their sales tax to public transportation. All right. In Minnesota, a new law added about $450 million in sales tax revenue to Metro Transit. This is for both operating and also rail expansion. And something to think about here is if you go to taxpayers and you say you want to increase your tax to provide the same amount of service you currently have, it doesn't get nearly as much excitement as if you say, we're going to increase the sales tax and we're going to give you something new and something shiny. Something else to think about is it's really hard if you're elected official and you go and say we need more money. It's a lot better if you have a big coalition that's pushing you along. So you can see in Minnesota, there are lots of different folks. So you can see these unions, environmentalists, public transportation advocates, some religious organizations, people who want to improve the environment. Lots of different organizations got together, put a lot of pressure on the legislature, and the legislature acted. In New York, there's an organization called the Riders Alliance. They have thousands of different members. And what they've done over time, really strategically, is they cultivate relationships in Albany and DC. So they don't just like go to the Congress folks. They don't just walk the halls in Albany asking for money. They're talking to the politicians and vetting them before they run for office. So you run for office, you've been elected, And you remember that these guys helped you get there. And in 2020, when the pandemic hit, they had relationships with two really important people. Chuck Schumer, he was the Senate Minority Leader from Brooklyn, and Hakeem Jeffries, he was the House Minority Leader from Queens. And that's the reason that there's $70+ billion that went for public transportation, because of the New York Riders Alliance and because they had the right connections at the right time. So they worked with lots of different groups here. I wrote immigrant rights organizations, social justice organizers, disability justice advocates, labor unions. You could keep on going to build this coalition for public transportation. And in 2023, New York State increased its sales tax, or I'm sorry, its payroll tax to fund transit to get over the fiscal cliff. There's another reason why New York City has been successful. It's because in the region, it's a regional transportation agency. If a city agency, it would be very different. Because it's a region, 2/3 of the state live within that Metropolitan Transportation Authority region. Gives it so much more clout up in Albany. All right, and then you might have heard there's a congestion pricing program where you have to pay to get into this zone. That's bringing in a lot of money. It's bringing in over $500 million for public transportation. It's also doing a lot of things that what people had been advocating. It reduces the number of cars, ambulances moving faster, fire trucks moving faster. And I love this number. Last year had the fewest traffic fatality accidents in New York City since they started keeping track in 1910. All right, another budget. This is Denver's. You can see their operating revenues. You can see on the left, or the second column there, went from $126 million to 60-something million dollars. Their sales tax jumped, and the grants, you could see they're kind of stable. Then they jumped during the pandemic, and then they're back to where they were before. A couple years ago, Denver, 8 counties approved a ballot measure with overwhelming support to provide more sales tax money to the transit agency. They're also making some money from their land. So the Regional Transit Agency in Denver, which is relatively new compared to most of the country, has 80 park and ride lots with 37,000 parking spots. That's a lot, 37,000 parking spots. Many of them have 2, 3, 4 times as many spaces as they need. They were overbuilt in the first place, and then the ridership just never showed up. So what the agency is doing is they're looking into long-term leases with developers. They're going to build parking garages instead of having these surface lots, and then they would have mixed-use developments. This helps them in 2 different ways. First, you bring in revenues because you're leasing this land over time. And then the new development is going to increase ridership because people are living there. And if you can walk to a station, you're much more likely to use the service than if you have to drive somewhere. Because once you're in your car, you're much more likely to stay in your car. So it's great for the region because you're concentrating development around existing infrastructure. You're minimizing sprawl. You're going to minimize traffic impacts. And also, the agency and the city together and the region together are looking at really promoting affordable housing. They're looking for about 1/3 of the units to be affordable. This works out really well because Denver, like Sacramento, has some affordable housing issues. And people who live in affordable homes are less likely to have cars, so they're even more likely to use public transportation. So it's kind of a win-win-win-win for everybody. Here's some pictures of some of the transit-oriented development in the Denver area. If you ever get a chance, they've done a great job downtown with where their light rail lines all come in and revitalizing the whole Denver Union Station area. Chicago, and Leo here has some direct experience with this. They're facing a huge shortfall that they calculated in 2022 was $730 million. They were really on top of it really early on. They have a lot of advocates, just like Minnesota and New York do. They lobbied the legislature to direct the MPO to develop a plan of action. So kind of like you guys getting together and saying, we're going to have a plan. What they did was they brought together academics, civic leaders, business leaders to figure out what they should do. And the first thing they did was they figured out, okay, what are the goals for the system? What do we want our system to look like? Then what are the options for funding the system? And then what's the ideal way of setting up the governance here? Because they felt like the institutions weren't really communicating and coordinating and integrating the way that was best for the customers. So the MPO approved the plan in 2023, went to the state legislature. The legislature didn't feel that that crisis. The first year, the second year they did. And then the advocates came out, and not only the advocates, but this is really interesting to me, the transit agency itself took a really strong position on how important this was. So these are some of the quotes here, that our regional transit system is going to be decimated if we don't do anything. It's going to be a devastating blow to the economy. It's a regional emergency. They put out some videos, really got the word out that this is a crisis and we have to do something about it. All sorts of different advocates like Minnesota and New York. And then last fall on Halloween, the legislature passed a bill and the governor then signed it, $1 billion a year that was coming from gas tax as well as regional sales tax. Now, this is a tough thing to think about because nobody knows exactly how to pinpoint some of these things. So every region will always have this sort of ambitious plan. We're going to build 35 miles of light rail line. We're going to build a brand new subway. We're going to spend $45 billion, and then the $45 billion turns into $250 billion, right? Agencies are always underestimating, and cities are always underestimating how much things are going to cost. So they're always scaling it back. So when I say it's a little hard to figure out, is they're scaling back now, but I'm not sure if it's that much different than what it usually is. Because like if you think about the California high-speed rail line, that's not a real shock that the cost estimates go up and up and up, and then they can't find the funding to do it. It just happens. It's been happening for generations. It happens across the world. But there has been recently some scaling back of these rail expansion programs, and I just picked a few cities out: Atlanta, Austin, Dallas, Charlotte, Phoenix, and Seattle. But again, they might have been overly ambitious in the first place and not really totally connected to what was going on. St. Louis is a little bit different, and something I think for a lot of people to think about is they were looking at a light rail line. They come up with the numbers, look at the ridership, and then they step back and say, maybe we should do a bus rapid transit instead. So that's what they're looking at now, a light rail turning into a bus rapid transit proposal. All right, so a few suggestions for you. You need partners. Don't do this by yourself, like New York and Minnesota and Chicago. The next one is protect your capital program. As a person who remembers what happened to New York in the 1980s and late 1970s from not doing that, to me, this is like the most important thing that I ever tell anybody, which is you have to make sure you maintain the system you have as opposed to starting to build new things or let things decay. So this is the average age of buses across the country. For some reason, people are content going into a light rail car that's 20 or 30 years old, or a bus that's 15 or 20 years old, but not a car that's that age. Light rail vehicles, look at Sacramento here. And I could see it when I first arrived in Sacramento. It's my first time here. It's a very nice place. But I was surprised by how old some of those cars were. So my caution is look what Philadelphia is doing and don't do it. So they were facing a $200 million deficit. And SEPTA, that's the regional transportation authority, said we're going to cut rail service by 20%. They're going to eliminate service after 9. They're going to get rid of a third of the bus routes. Kind of really scary. And I thought this was just sort of a scare tactic to get the legislature to act. But the legislature didn't act. SEPTA created this video to say, hey, we have to do something now. It's a crisis. They created a map, which I think was wonderful, where you can put in where you live, where you work to see how you're going to get hurt. Like, is your service going to get eliminated? Are you going to have reduced service? It's really, really helpful as opposed to this sort of abstract thought about cutting service. No, this is how it's going to affect me. I won't be able to get to work at 9. I have to leave 45 minutes early or whatever it's going to be. So the governor and the state assembly supported shifting money from the state sales tax to SEPTA. The Senate wouldn't agree. This was a Democrat-Republican thing that happened here. And also, I think when the governor's considering running for president, maybe there's some people who are not trying to help him, right? So last summer, the judge put those service cuts on hold. So SEPTA couldn't cut the service to balance their budget. So the only choice they felt they had, because the state wasn't coming in to help, was to use capital money to pay for operating expenses. And it's a much worse problem in Philadelphia than Sacramento, because their rail cars are even older than Sacramento's. 34 years old is the average age. Now, when you have old assets, they're more expensive to operate. They're less reliable. They cost more to maintain. They're not as safe. They're not secure. And you're just punting, right? You have to deal with this at some point, and you're just making things more expensive. If you go to July 4th, you celebrate the 250th anniversary of our country. You'll see they have so many bridges that aren't from the 19th century. I'm sorry, not from the 20th century, but from the 19th century. They're really expensive to maintain. All right, my last suggestion is you should get your house in order before you start telling people you need to cut their service, or before you say we need to increase your taxes. So in Denver, a couple of accountability committees were set up. And I thought this was a good idea, because sometimes if you guys say something, or if the transit agency says something, people aren't necessarily going to believe it. But if you bring in some outside folks, it adds a little bit of credibility to this. So this was not exactly service cuts, but this was sort of looking at what RTD could do and how it could change. So my second thought is, see if anybody wants to take a guess on this one. If you go to Charlotte, San Diego, or a bus in New York City, what % of people do you think are not paying or paying for their fares? Anybody want to take a guess here? No, they're all the same. That's why I picked these three. They're all the same. What do you think? 49% are paying or not paying? It's kind of the same, right? Okay, 49% are evaders. Anybody else? Whoa. Whoa. Okay. So I think 49 is about right. It's about that. It's almost half. So I owe YOLO month. It reminds me, I got on a YOLO bus from the airport last night, and I only had $2 and not 2 1/4. So I owe 25 cents to somebody here.
Right there. Get him.
So I think it's really hard to say you want to increase the sales tax if you're not collecting the money from the people who are supposed to be paying. Portland, and it's a good lesson here on what they're doing, is they took their time and they asked their customers, they asked the public what we should do. So first they had a survey in person, and open houses and at stations and online, asking people what their priorities were. And then the next year they had, these are our proposed services that we want to cut back. What do you think? And they use this to help shape what their cuts were. So they cut some expenses, because you have to look like you're getting your house in order, right? So they limited some open positions, both union and non-union. They laid off some staff. They cut travel, materials, contract services, reduced the service. So they're looking at a 10% cut over a couple of years here. They slowed down some of the increases that they planned on doing. And then they said, we want a fair increase in 2028, which is really a long time if you haven't increased it. And then also the legislature came in. So the legislature came in and said, we're going to raise the fuel tax. We're going to charge drivers a little bit more money. And we're going to increase the payroll tax. This went into effect. The legislature passed it. The governor signed it. And then some people didn't like it so much. And they got enough signatures to put this on the ballot. So it was actually on the ballot, today's Thursday, 2 days ago. So what the vote would have done is, if the vote was yes, it would have kept this in place. If the vote was no, it would cancel out and negate the changes that were made last year. So this is how it gets framed. Oregon voters decide whether to boost their gas tax as the Iran war causes prices. So the governor and the legislature, they stepped back. They didn't want to really be seen as supporting this. There were no committees. There was no organized campaign like you saw in Chicago and New York and Minnesota. Nobody raised money, no PAC. Anybody want to guess what the results were from Tuesday? Anybody guess what number of people supported it? What percent? 17. 17% supported it. It was like there's no one advocating it. It looks like it's a gas tax. At the same time, prices are shooting up. Really bad timing, really poorly organized. So I just wanted to end on that Portland story because it looks like things are get fixed and then they're not fixed. And I think that's the history of transit. If you go back decades and decades, it's like they always need their handout. They always need to get subsidized. It's just a question of who's going to do it and when and how. All right. So more than happy to answer questions. And if we run out of time, I'll stick around after the meeting too.
Thank you, Dr. Plotch. I assume we've got some questions from board members. Yes.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation, very thorough, and covered a lot of bases. Oh, sorry about that. And so I'll try and not unpack the whole thing, but I just want to make a little bit of comments regarding it. And you hit on what I think are a couple of crux issues that have to be discussed before we seek more revenue. And the number one is fare box recovery ratio. I remember, and I don't think it's a Mandela effect, I remember when there used to be a threshold of 28% fare box recovery in order to be eligible for funding. I don't remember if that was from FTA or from CTC or who, but nonetheless, this was kind of like, you guys have to have your house in order, as you put, either through expenses and or through fair amounts at this level. So to not even make that effort anymore, to me, is disingenuous when you say we need more money. Well, no, we need to be realistic about who is riding, why they're riding, and what they're paying. To that point, you mentioned that Lyft and Uber and ride shares are cutting into transit. Well, that tells me then that being the cheapest isn't necessarily the fastest way to get more riders. It's having something that works for people. So then that begs the second question in the transit industry, which is, do you focus on frequency or on coverage? And I think my colleague recognizes that I have beat this drum for a long time now. If you are spending vast amounts of money to run empty buses into every nook and cranny of every community, you are throwing money away. You're lighting it on fire and throwing it away for that one person who chooses to live in the most difficult place because they want to ride transit from there, rather than building that backbone infrastructure, be it fixed transit, rail or others, or bus rapid transit, which I don't think is necessarily a lesser plan B. I think the future of transit is actually autonomous electric vehicles that act as people movers and get them around quickly. Because if you had a system in Sacramento that I could walk out of one edge of Sacramento, hop on something that I know is going to get me across to the other edge, and then from there I can choose to take a scooter, an e-bike, an Uber, whatever. Now that's something that works for me. But in addition to that, it has to be clean. It has to be safe. Clean is a big one. When you talk to people, cleanliness, safety, reliability, these are important factors. And so I say that because the 49%, and I will exclude my colleague, Mr. Howdeschelt, in this, but the 49% who are evading fares, some of them are damaging our ability to capture fares from other riders because they're creating a system that is not attractive to people who have the means or the desire to provide. So I'm making more commentary than necessarily asking questions, but I will end by saying this, that when we talk about wicked problems, and we look at a Gordian knot, right, which was if somebody can untangle this mess, they will rule Asia. And everybody tried to untangle the knot, and Alexander the Great came along and he pulled out a sword and he just cut it. And he said, I untangled it, and he ruled Asia for, he had a pretty good run. So because he solved the problem differently. So I think we need to stop nibbling at the edges and look at how we re-envision our expectations of what transit ought to be, how it is served. Because my estimation would be, if you build a really robust, and the other piece that you mentioned about TODs on former park and ride lots, I agree that's an attractive solution because you have to have the density on those fixed transit lines. The problem is now you're removing the ability for people to utilize that last mile system if we were to have that working. So I think we've got to reimagine our expectations, have a level set, and then we look at what our funding gap is. But thank you for the very thorough presentation.
Chair, I have a comment.
Yes.
Thank you. Actually, Supervisor Hume and I went to the conference last year on transit in Boston. And one of the things I was specifically looking for is data tracking for riders. Just because you set a route and that route might be there for 15, might be there for 30 years, the demographics move away from that. You have families that are in that on that particular demographic. They're on that route. They're using transit. The kids grow up, parents move away, the ridership dissipates. So I didn't hear anything in your in your presentation with regard to people move around. And just because you put a transit route like the one that I live on, it's been there for since probably 40 years. And it's not, maybe at one time it was highly utilized. It's not highly utilized anymore. And so these are things that I don't hear. We both sit on the Sacramento RT board. We don't hear this discussion about where did the ridership go? And this is that there's data out there, specifically Uber offers the data you can purchase to learn where the ridership is, but this is a really valuable discussion. And to back up what Supervisor Humes just said, this is the really hard work that very few people really want to engage in. They really look at this and go, okay, how do we study this? What is the criteria that we're going to study? And we just want to raise taxes. We just think, well, we just need more money. So instead of studying the issue, we're just going to raise taxes. And that's really, in my opinion, lazy. Thank you.
There, both of those comments I agree with, but they're hard. Like, if you want to cut service to sort of the exurban area or you might lose support for regional sales tax, right? And if you want to optimize service within a city, you're going to hurt some people, and you might make it more efficient, but it's a difficult thing to do.
You're never going to make everybody happy 100% of the time.
Yeah.
No matter what decision you make, somebody's going to feel hurt.
Yeah.
So that, look, I am sensitive to that, but it's hard decisions that we make. We make this every day. This is why we ran for office. And so I just have to look at that and say, yeah, I don't want to hurt people, but hey, sometimes we have to make a hard decision, and that's tough to do. And so here we are.
Great. Additional questions? Yes. Director Branscombe.
Dr. Platts, you're the real deal. It was a great presentation.
Thanks.
You bet. I highlighted a couple of comments or features. One was protect the capital program. And that was closely connected to the average age of the equipment, buses in particular. We have a role, SACOG has a role in what happens with the transit agencies. We don't control, but we have a role.
Mm-hmm.
James can talk about that at an appropriate time. How should we feel if transit agency converts a lot of capital money to operating money and therefore doesn't protect the capital program? How should we feel about that?
I think you have to look really closely at what they're doing, right? If they're, let's say it's a facility where you're fixing the buses, you're not upgrading it, and you're thinking, oh, the customers don't care what goes on at that bus depot where you fix buses. Or does it mean that the buses aren't going to be as clean or they're not going to be as reliable because you're using old equipment? Does it mean that you won't be able to convert to electric buses or compressed natural gas buses? So you have to look at the details of what they're cutting when it comes to any kind of capital expense.
Well, I'm presuming if you convert a lot of capital money to operating money, then and you also have an average age of your rolling fleet that is well above the average. It was on the high end of the examples you showed.
Yeah.
That would be concerning. That would have to be very concerning. Another question, I've been studying the budgets for SAC-RT. And I've noticed that they show depreciation expense as a non-operating item. Now, my background, I've been on boards of two public companies where I've been on the audit committee of two boards where Sarbanes-Oxley requires expertise for members on the audit committees. I've got a decent feeling for how things should be. And I've never seen depreciation expense as non-operating. Is that standard through the industry?
I'll take a look and I can get back to you on it. Okay.
Yeah, no, it struck me because that we're also seeing data from SACRT that shows the average cost per mile, what have you. And they're connecting it to operating expense. And if they're not including the depreciation expense, which is 40-something million, then it's understated by about 13%, these other data. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Director Branscombe. Additional questions? Yes.
Thank you. First, I always have to caveat everything. I'm in El Dorado County, so I deal with the guy that's back there in the blue shirt and his transit agency. So I'm always very careful what I say about what's going on down here and things like RT. Honestly, it's good that we're having this. That was, once again, great presentation. You're talking to the wrong people because actually, except for the people on this body that sit on the RT board, we eventually will have a role in this, but until RT kind of has a come to Jesus moment, and I'll give you some, so we got this 125 money that's been floating around. We got a big chunk of it 4 years ago. It's running out. My first time back, I got voted off the island in Placerville, and then I got voted back on. And when I came back on, I got to be down here again. And we had a meeting 2 years ago, and we were doling out 125 money, and it was obvious that the money was going to disappear well before the 4th year of the 4 years. And I remember making a comment like, maybe we ought to be, RT, once again, you can tell me to, what I think in a couple dollars to get you a cup of coffee somewhere. But I was kind of going, they need to deal with this problem now. Because either they were waiting for the folks at the Capitol to do something, which it doesn't look like they're going to do, or they're going to have this thing. And so we gave them some money, and then they came this year and we gave them some more money. And then the gentleman stood over there and said, well, we're going to start cannibalizing our capital funds to keep the operating going. I should have been bolder and voted no on the 125 money. To be perfectly honest with you, I should have voted no, because I didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. I thought that there had to be some hard decisions made, and we're just kicking this can down the road. And what happens with RT is eventually going to kick back to the folks outside of the RT region. It'll eventually get back to all of us. And I think we should have just had a real hard vote. I didn't do that. I weaned out, as it were, mostly because I defer to everybody else that actually works in the district. But until RT comes back with a plausible plan, all the things you said, service, if they ask for money, this thing you won't get 17% of a vote in this region if you were to ask for a tax increase. And I just don't see how it gets better until RT comes back with a real honest plan that doesn't talk about how they're going to take another $50 million out of their capital fund. And I just don't see how that works. And the other thing too, sometimes when you're looking at other regions, they have significantly different taxing structures, and they have availability of taxes in some ways that we don't here in California, just by legislation and desire. Anyway, for all of my friends here, I think that's got to happen way before. Well, we don't have any more money to give them, for one thing. We ran out of 125. We milked that cow. Anyway, that's it. I think this discussion needs to be happening at the provider level, and then they should come in. And if we ever do have any extra money, we could talk about that.
Chair Bradford and Director Polito, if I just made a few comments. So first of all, this is exactly in Transportation Committee earlier this month, we had this discussion, right? It's timely, it's important, it's a tough one. We have a role, although the transit operators who are here today are the primary experts on delivering service. But a couple of things, and that's part of why we brought Dr. Plotch out here. This is not just a SACRT issue. It looks biggest because SACRT carries 90% of the riders, right? But you'll see in the next presentation on SB 125 and the report, they're almost commensurate with the amount of riders, number one. Number two, and I'm not trying to convince you otherwise of where you're heading in all this, of like, wow, this is a problem. How do we fix this? Do you remember, as we've talked about in Transportation Committee, I don't think we'd ever say that Sacramento International Airport is a failure. It's one of the best things we've got going. 13 million riders a year. We have 22 million people who take rides on transit in this region every year. Granted, they take them almost every day, but it is a service. And I know you all know this, and Director Schaefer just mentioned, and perhaps that also is why you're thinking frequency over coverage. Let's make sure that those people who rely on transit and it actually works for them, we keep this service maintained. And then finally, just our presenter had a lot of trivia. So the map with how many transit agencies actually turn a profit. Just remember, we could do the similar thing on the roadside and the map would be blank. This morning, the House Transportation Committee in Congress is debating a new federal transportation bill. And my trivia question is, how much of that is actually covered by what you pay in federal gas tax? Less than 50%, right? So we basically subsidize every form of transportation. Maybe aviation is the outlier. So just, I want to keep those things in mind. That is not to say we don't have a crisis and a fiscal cliff, because we do. And you're going to hear more of this in the next presentation, but I wanted to offer those thoughts.
I'd like to respond.
We're going to let Director.
Because I'd like to respond to you as well.
Go.
I did not sit on the SACRT board. I was part of making that vote of a yes for SB 125. And I think you made the right vote, if that's any consolation for you. I think we made the
It's
right
tremendous
vote.
consolation.
Good. I think that to have voted no and said you just have to hurry up and figure your stuff out would have been extremely irresponsible to this region and the riders that are depending on that. I am talking about youth, I'm talking about working families, I'm talking about real people who have no other option than public transportation. That is our responsibility. Yes, that was a hard vote. Yes, we are all dealing with real fiscal consequences and a cliff that is impending. But and I think this is what we heard in your presentation, by the way, but to make extreme cuts overnight would have been irresponsible. And we saw that. I think that what we have with SB 125, and we've talked about this in our transportation committee as well, is an opportunity to plan, right? To your point, there's no more money left. We are at the end of this road. And I know with YTD, we have spent the past year, 2 years, having this discussion and having real conversations about not just cuts, but what else we can do, alternatives. I know that SACRT is doing that. We've heard that SACRT is doing that, I believe, in my colleagues. And I'm looking forward to being able to use the data that we got here, information. For me, this was amazing, by the way. Excellent presentation. It got me thinking about even conversations we had this week with YTD about significant budget cuts that we're going to have to make, where those should be. How do we get our house in order? And I think what SB 125 provided us was a little bit more time to make thoughtful, intentional, strategic moves and decisions so that the most vulnerable of our community that depends on this will not be as significantly impacted. The reality is, with budget cuts, yes, people are going to hurt. I would argue with all of our decisions, intentional or not, people get hurt. There are consequences to every single decision that we make as electeds. Budgets are reflections of our priorities. And I think that we are going to have to get really honest about what our priorities are.
Director Habershot.
Yeah, thank you. Very thought-provoking presentation. And I'm going to take Professor Hume's class. I'm going to audit your class. I love the term Gordian knot, and I'm wondering. Make sure your tuition is up to date. I get a senior discount. Okay. But you know, I think of external things and sort of a catch-22. One of your slides said, I forget which transit agency laid off 26 non-union. And I'm thinking, okay, were those non-union folks people to keep the trains clean, maintained, right? Not maintained, but you know, so that has a countervailing impact. I think Director Schaefer's example is a fantastic example. We see it in school districts where the population, you know, diminishes. And then, you know, earlier this week or late last week, I saw an article that in New York, the union in New York for hospitality workers, you know, they have a minimum wage of $100,000. Now in New York, that's not right. That's probably 15,000 in our lives. You know, I looked this up to make sure I was right about this. Union Pacific went bankrupt in the late 1800s. SpaceX, I think, is upside down right now. But what we need to do is we need to vision a future and look at these things. Josh and I are sitting on the Capitol Corridor Joint Powers Authority visioning plan. We need to vision what the future is, because it is, transit is, gosh, I don't want to use this term. Transit is an important part of mobility. I think that's the best way to say it, okay? And I mean, I would love to know, when we were in Denver, one of the things the impression I got from Denver, and I probably have this wrong, was they were surprised how much of the trips were being taken, how long the trips were on e-bikes and e-scooters, you know, because you're in a dense area there. So I do think we need to figure out a way, you know, forward. I don't know if implied in yours, some of these bars and graphs and everything takes into account an aging workforce, right? Or reduction in government, in the government workforce. But I'd be curious to find a way to ensure that there is some transit system out there that captures as much of the dollars as possible. I'd like to take a deep dive and see what kind of visioning plan we can do for our region. Thank you.
Thanks. Director.
Yeah, well, you got it. Ms. Early left. If SB 125 was a way for us to gain space to make decisions, then we should have been having this conversation 4 years ago. Because we might be in a better place if we just said, these are finite dollars, they're going to help us bridge this gap. We are seeing these trends in the thing, because 4 years ago, these trends existed. And if that had been what 125 is, as it was described to me just now, then we should have been doing this 4 years ago. And then we wouldn't be running around, because I still say there's going to be a reckoning here.
Yeah.
That's
I
the
think,
next
yeah, our
agenda
next
item,
agenda
I
item.
think. Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is-
And the difference between roads and transit, more people use the roads in transit, and they will subsidize the roads all day long. But when it comes to this other thing, and transit's important, don't get me wrong. I represent a county that's way poorer than any county in this room. Lassen County. They got nothing going on up there. They lose 1% of their population every year. Those people rely on transit. We fight for transit up there because they actually need it to get around. And that's not to say there aren't people down here, but don't talk to me about the needs of transit, because I deal with it as a professional every day.
Thank you. Additional questions? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to state some obvious. First of all, Director Hume and I both sit on the same RT board, and we find ourselves pretty much in agreement on everything that you said. So I feel like I want to speak on, as a member of RT board. RT has improvement to make. There's no question about it. I welcome you to listen to the Transportation Committee comments to see where I stand on that. But one thing I just want to make clear, and this is where I'm stating the obvious, but I just want to say it, and that's that let's not forget the societal benefits of transit, many of which were expressed by Director Early. People say government should act more like a business. I understand what you're saying, but that's simplistic. We're not a business. Transit is not a business. Transit is always going to lose money and need subsidy. I know you all know that, but it needs to be said. How much is the question? How much can we afford to continue to subsidize transit? I agree with that, but it is something that we are making a public investment in for the public good, and specifically for people who need that investment. So let's not forget about the societal benefits when we have these discussions. Thank you.
Great. Any additional questions, comments? Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. We do have, I believe, one public comment on this item. Mr. Mandelkern. Mr. Mandelkern, if you could, if you, are you're going to take the question offline, you can go outside if you'd like to ask him as part of the board meeting, if you'd come up to the podium. Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Perfect.
Briefly, what I wanted to state or ask, because Philip stated that he works for the Eno Center. I have turned to that. I was recently looking at something that was related to managed lanes and the toll roads, and it's kind of related to something that James Corliss talked about yesterday regarding funding. My point is that the person who came up with the idea of managed lanes. He also proposed an idea for highway funding, and his idea is about, his name is Robert Poole, by the way. Robert Poole's idea was that now, given some of the stuff that Philip talked about regarding federal funding, that maybe it's now a time for highway funding to take more of a model to rely less on federal and go more for state and local funding, based on what James also talked about yesterday regarding SACOG 5's implementation as a toll lane. My point, suggestion, question was going to be, what about applying that same strategy to transit? Rely less on federal, go for more state and local. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next item, item 8, which is an informational item, Senate Bill 125, Long-Term Financial Plan and Recovery Strategy, Draft Recommendations Overview. And Leo's going to present on this as well.
Morning. The information item before you is, of course, for discussion, but staff is also seeking policy direction from the board on the set of strategies that we're going to go over today, because many of these actions, strategies and actions will be a core part of SACOG's work plan on transit over the next few years. So talked about it a little bit, but just as a reminder, Senate Bill 125 was an emergency funding stream for transit agencies in the region and across the state after federal pandemic aid was expended. In return for that funding, the state legislature wanted some additional accountability from each region. In particular, they wanted plans for how the region intends to keep transit afloat after these one-time funds were gone. And so the draft financial forecasts and suite of strategies that we're talking about today are SACOG's response to those accountability requirements. However, setting aside the statutory kind of requirement deadline, transit is a core part of achieving the goals and aspirations that we set out in the 2025 blueprint. And so this financial sustainability plan is really the first step in helping keep our transit system afloat, remain financially viable in the long term, and delivers on a key policy action that's included in the blueprint. It's good to note that these state requirements apply to regional transportation planning agencies, which means that El Dorado County and Placer County have their own individual requirement for this exercise, but we've coordinated with them along the way because we know that the transit fiscal cliff impacts everyone in the 6-county region. So on that note, I'd like to pass it over to Nathan Masick from HDR, who's online with us, who will talk a little bit about the development of the draft financial forecasts for the 5 operators in the 4 counties and the engagement we've had with them throughout that process.
Okay, Hey, Chair
Thank you.
Bradford, and do you mind if I just say one quick thing? We just want to orient you on where you are because we did the workshop first so that we could have this discussion. As Leo said, we're looking for your feedback and input. This is draft. And then we're going to come back with a final in June through the Transportation Committee up to the board to adopt, to then send to the state CalSTA agency. So I do want to make sure you're all aware that this is important. Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Thanks, Nate.
No problem. Thank you, Leo, and thank you, Chair. My name is Nate Masick from HDR. I apologize for joining you remotely. My thunderstorms yesterday here on the East Coast kept me at the airport for a very long time, but the flight to Sacramento ultimately did not make it into the air to join you today. But you are joined in the room by Matt Olson and Lisa Moriali from HDR. So they're both based in our Sacramento office, and happy to be with you today. I want to talk a little bit about our methodology for this first, which is really looking ahead at what the financial plans look like for the 5 operators in the region that are subject to the SB 125 requirements. And just to set the stage here, for this analysis, we were looking at historical data for each of these agencies in terms of their operating and capital expenditures and sources of funds. We met with the agencies or the operators, and we talked with them about how they see their costs and revenue streams unfolding in the future. So this was a very collaborative process between SACOG, the operators, and ourselves as the consultant team to get information from the operators and to develop projections of what their financial scenarios might look like into the future. So what we're working with here is the best information available to us to take a 10-year outlook at the operating sources and uses of funds for each agency, taking into account the service levels that they're operating today. Importantly, we did not make any assumptions about new revenue streams beyond the funding sources that are already funding each of these agencies. We made assumptions about how existing funding streams might reasonably grow in the future, given inflationary growth or historically informed growth trends for funding streams, because we don't expect them to be flat necessarily, but we also didn't want to sort of mix apples and oranges by introducing new funds to this analysis. So it continues to work with the existing streams that each of these agencies have at their disposal today. The other thing is that we were looking to hold service levels constant in this analysis. So we were trying to get our arms around what might the fiscal outlook be for these operators if their service levels were to be maintained at the levels that they're currently at, and how does that projection of the costs associated with those service levels compare to the funding streams that might be available for each of them. So without any further ado, let me switch to the next slide here, which what we're going to do is talk about what we were looking at and finding with respect to the projected operating trends for the 5 agencies. The main headline here is that 4 of the 5 agencies are facing a fiscal cliff over the next few years. Now, importantly, that we're looking further than the next fiscal year here to really show what might be happening as soon as federal agencies fiscal year 2028, and then towards the end of the projection period that we were looking at 2035. So looking out about 2 years and then 10 years into the future. So you can see the projections. I'm going to go line by line here with each of the operators to show what we were finding in terms of their projected deficit in 2028 and then 2035. So we'll start with SAC-RT, projected operating deficit in 28 of 25.1 million, which represents about 9% of its annual operating budget. And that compares to a projected operating deficit by the time we get out to 2035 of 46.2 million, which is about 13% of the operating budget. So you can see that it's growing over time as a share of its operating budget. Now, the dollar values are going to change for each agency, and the percentages are going to vary as well. Because of course each agency has very different budgets. SAC-RT is significantly larger than the other operators in the region. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about this in terms of dollar terms and percentage terms for these projections. For Unitrans, showing a projected operating deficit of 406,000 or 4% of the operating budget by 2028. And that's growing to 1.9 million annually by 2035, or 14% of the operating budget. One note there is that we did get some additional information from Unitrans regarding projected student enrollment at UC Davis. Students there pay a fee for transit as part of their tuition payments, and that helps to pay for the Unitrans system. With that additional revenue accounted for, it does change the deficits. There are still projected deficits in 28 and 35, but not as large as what we're showing here, and we will be circling back with revised numbers on that in the next iteration of our reports. YOLO TD projected operating deficit of 5.1 million in 28, which is 20% of its operating budget, and then that grows to 9.8 million by 2035, or 29% of its operating budget. Yuba Sutter, about $390,000, or 4% of its operating budget. That grows to $2.4 million and 17% of its operating budget. SCT Link is the one outlier here. It's the one operator in the region that no deficit was projected, but of course it's a much smaller operator than the others in the region. So I think the key things about how we address this is that, you know, there's really there's ways that people are dealing with it now, and then there's ways that you know, you manage your costs in order to make full use of the revenues you have without creating a deficit. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies in the next slide. So as you heard in the earlier presentation, one of the key points here is that transit's in trouble everywhere. That what we're talking about here with the projected deficits for the operators in the Sacramento region are not unique to this region, and that they're consistent with trends that we're seeing in by other operators around the country. So you know, I think this just builds on the presentation that you just had here, so I won't belabor this point, but we do have a structural imbalance in revenue and expense growth because transit expenses are increasing faster than sales tax revenue, which are a major source of funding for transit. So how do we address that? And I think the next slide gets at that, which is that some agencies are deferring their capital maintenance to sustain service. And this is a strategy where you do have an ability to use some of your funds that may be available to support capital and flexing those over to support operations to help maintain service levels. And that keeps the service on the street, but it also comes at the cost of service reliability. As you know, you use those funds to pay for operations, then they're not available to maintain the infrastructure at a state of good repair, or to replace the vehicles in a timely manner, or to do some of the other things that might be needed to make sure that the service has the capital infrastructure that's needed to operate reliably. We talked a little bit about vehicle life for SAC-RT in the previous presentation, but 28% of, when we look at the whole region and all the operators in the region, and the 5 that we're looking at as part of this study, 28% of the transit vehicles are past their useful life when we look at NTD data. And a side impact on that also has an impact on how much funds are available for other purposes, is that the state zero emission mandate creates a pressure here because it's requiring the purchase of lower emissions vehicles, electric vehicles, that are a costlier vehicle type, and they come with the tremendous benefit of being zero emission vehicles, but there is a real cost of that. In terms of more expensive vehicles. So, you know, Sacramento area operators, they're aiming for their best service for their communities by maintaining transit service levels, but they're forced to make difficult decisions knowing that there are long-term risks with the current operating funding environment. I'm going to turn it back over to Leo, and he's going to talk about you know, the essentialness of transit and some of the ways to make sure that it can continue to sustain itself here in the region.
Thanks, Nate. Appreciate it. We had a great discussion during the workshop about this, so won't belabor the point. But you know, these are difficult times for transit, the transit industry in general. But one thing we know is that the service on the street today is an essential part of daily life for thousands of people here in the region. It's a crucial opportunity connector. The service helps people get to their jobs, schools, doctor appointments, and more, and it does so in a way that's affordable, especially at a time when costs are very high. And so that affordability and that connection to opportunity that our transit system provides helps improve social and economic outcomes for everyone, including those of us that don't ride transit. but is especially important for our region's lower income households, seniors, youth, people of color, who are disproportionately dependent on that service, according to our own travel data. Another thing we also know, though, and acknowledge that it's a difficult topic of conversation and has been discussed this morning, is that cutting some service may be unavoidable, but how we cut service matters just as much as how much service needs to be cut. And so just as an example here, using the financial model that HDR developed and SACOG's own travel data, staff simulated service cuts that would be best described as across the board, overnight emergency, budget balancing solutions. And our analysis shows broad negative impacts to the crucial access that transit provides to people that currently depend on that service. That includes a 70% reduction in access to jobs by transit for these households, and thousands of fewer transit-dependent households with access to healthcare and education. For transit riders who would still have access to some service, their trips will take longer simply because trains and buses will no longer arrive as frequently.
Excuse me. Could you go back to that slide? I'm trying to understand the heading there, your thesis. Cost of cutting service without a strategy. I don't get it. I mean, obviously, there's cost of cutting service. What's the without a strategy? What strategy is going to avoid that?
I think Philip's example of how Portland is thinking about service reductions is really good. And in fact, in the way that they are engaging with the public, they're planning for these things rather than, feeling like there's a cliff coming and having to cut service overnight, right? So it's just a strategic approach to cutting service rather than wholesale cuts.
Okay, you didn't sell me, but thank you.
Do you have an example of cost cutting without a strategy? An agency? What would be the?
Would it be kind of what was
Yeah, I think
mentioned
most
earlier,
of us are-
potentially, when we talked about frequency versus coverage? And if you, maybe as opposed to cutting frequency, which sends you down a spiral, if you cut coverage, then that's a smarter way to maintain as much ridership as you can. I mean, that's kind of what I heard earlier. So I assume that's the kind of thing we're going to be.
Okay, fine, great.
That's correct. Yeah, that's a great example. All right. Additionally, there is a dire need to avoid what Philip touched on, which the industry calls the transit death spiral, because how we cut service can, again, potentially set off a chain reaction that is difficult to recover from and creates a self-reinforcing cycle that reduces an agency's revenues, and therefore they have to cut service even more. And lastly, as you already heard this morning, our peers are also facing a transit fiscal cliff. We're not alone in this. And many have already reduced some service to avoid falling off of that cliff and having to do those overnight cuts. But over the past few decades, these peers have also provided dedicated sources of funding for their transit systems, and on average, run more than double the amount of service than we run in our region. And in return for that investment, these peers see at least triple the amount of transit ridership per capita than we do, despite some of them having lower population densities. And so while cutting service is unavoidable, we're already behind our peers in this regard and now risk further falling behind the pack if we cut more service. So with some of that context from Nate, we did want to have a discussion about what we can do as a region and what exactly is SACOG's role in all of this. And so our draft recommendations present a two-pronged approach, one which is focused on the near-term and long-term funding needs of the transit system, and the other is on improving the rider experience through low-cost interventions, which is just an acknowledgement that now more than ever, the transit customer needs to be at the forefront of every decision that we make while being mindful of the financial realities that we're living in. And so we had a great discussion about this at the Transportation Committee. So I'm going to connect the dots between the feedback we got at the committee and the strategies and actions that we're proposing today for discussion. So on the funding side, a core part of the committee's discussion was an honest and frank conversation that business as usual cannot continue, and that we have to explore every option on the table to minimize service cuts as much as possible. And so the first strategy here on the screen mirrors what other agencies do when they expect a deficit, which is to identify any potential savings and efficiencies that could be available before reducing services. We're proposing that transit agencies with the most immediate financial pressures, which are SACRT and YOLO TD, partner with SACOG to explore what those options and opportunities could be outside of just cutting service. We also heard that SACOG plays a unique role at the committee's discussion in convening people and organizations to have difficult regional conversations. And we know that funding for transit is one of those. And so while we have the SB 125 funding to sustain our region service, and we have that time built in, our second strategy is focused on bringing together our transit partners, cities and counties and policymakers to have a conversation about what the future of transit funding should look like, including ways that the system itself can self-generate revenues, like we just discussed, with SACOG helping to facilitate that conversation. We also heard from the Transportation Committee about the state's zero-emission transition that obviously poses a huge financial burden to agencies at a time when finances are precarious. And so while the committee's discussion mentioned that the goal to electrify was important, the current timeline of the mandate will shift resources away from where they're needed most right now. And so our third strategy is proposing a really first in the state regional compliance waiver application from the Air Resources Board's upcoming 2029 transition requirements that requires all new buses to be zero emission. These waiver applications are built into the Air Resources Board's mandate, and some of our own transit agencies are already looking into using them, and so we're just proposing a regional application to that. And the last strategy here reflects the committee's discussion around service cuts and our own analysis I just talked about that shows that the region needs to be strategic in how we reduce service. And this again aligns with the example from Portland that Philip mentioned, which is that if service cuts are on the table here, which seems like they are, the transit agencies and SACOG could develop a data-driven framework to ensure that we can mitigate the impacts to transit-dependent riders as much as possible. On the transit customer experience side, we do want to acknowledge that the transit operators are already making a lot of progress on improving regional connections and making paying for transit fares easier and more seamless. And so the low-cost strategies and actions that we're proposing are simply just meant to build on that progress. So for example, we want to focus on making transfers and travel times between the region's 10 transit systems faster to show that the system can operate as one unified regional network. We want to standardize customer information across all the operators, so regardless of what system you're using, customers will know where to look for the service that they need. And again, underway right now is the modernization of our transit fare payment system to make it as easy to pay for a transit fare as it is to tap your card to buy a cup of coffee. But we know that there are additional fare integration and coordination opportunities that we've seen implemented in other regions, and we want to look into what those could look like for our own system here. Last two here for me, the committee also discussed strengthening the bus network. And it was a really important point because 60% of the region's transit ridership is on buses. The strategy that we're proposing focuses on identifying the highest ridership routes and corridors for each operator and county and proposing low-cost treatments and a funding plan to improve the speed and reliability of those buses. Things like transit signal priority is a good example of speed improvements that we could make with minimal costs relative to other capital investments. And the last strategy is going to help us all understand if all of these efforts are going to be effective through the wealth of service, operations, and ridership data that every transit operator produces individually. And so we're proposing a regional approach to that data collection and visualization and analysis so that we can just better track what's working and what's not. That's it for me on the draft recommendations. I'll pass it over to James to round us out.
Okay, a couple more quick slides and then we're going to get your feedback. We had, as Leah mentioned, a really good discussion at the Transportation Committee earlier this month. And I think it was Director Boomgarden who said, but hey, SACOG has a role in transit. And it was not unlike what you're seeing before you. But just to remind you all, you both have a role as serving on a transit agency board. When you come to this boardroom, you have to wear that hat. But secondly, obviously, both in our long-range plan and our blueprint, we plan for the future of transit. Funding, our funding rounds that you're going to be overseeing this year that have been restructured. That is a big source of capital funds for our transit operators. Advocacy and influence, Leo just mentioned CARB and the zero emission mandate, right? And our ability to advocate. And then finally, oversight in terms of data and performance targets and financial audits and the rest. So just a reminder that those are the roles that we play. And as you think about this, you can give us the feedback of putting more emphasis on an area, putting less emphasis on an area. But those are the roles that we already play. And if you want to just do the next slide. So, all right, open for now your discussion, your feedback. Leo walked through those recommendations in the two categories. We'd love to get your thoughts this morning. And then we'll bring this back, as I said, to the Transportation Committee in June, then the full board on June 18th.
Thank you, Leo and James. Director Habershell.
Yeah, Leo, I may have misunderstood what you said, but I thought you referred to 10 transit agencies?
I believe
And
so.
Connecting the 10 transit agencies?
Yeah,
Did
a
you
little
say
more than
that?
10.
Yeah, there's 10 operators in the region.
10 operators in Sacramento, Yolo, Yuba Sutter.
No, there's 10 in the 6 county, there's 5 in the 4 county.
5 deals with Yolo, Yuba Sutter, and Sac,
Right.
right? And
That's
Yuba
right.
Transit. So I wanted to make sure I heard that right. You're advocating, are you advocating, or are you laying on the table for discussion interconnectivity between El Dorado, Placer, Lassen? But is that what you're, it sounded strongly like you were advocating for that.
Well, I'll say it this way. Your statutory requirement is to deliver a report on SB 125 for the 4 county RTPA region.
Right.
I think what we're giving you in terms of recommendations is how do we make the region's transit network more effective? Which again, a lot of the operators are here today. And so in your recommendations, depending on where you want to, when we go and advocate, we advocate for 6 counties. That could include El Dorado and Placer in those.
Okay.
Up to you. Give us your feedback.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And probably I should have raised this in the previous discussion, but I think, James, it was first attributed to you by former mayor for the city of Roseville, Susan Rohan, that you were visionary when you talked about changing our mobility from fixed routes to more of an Uber style, and we have that in Placer County, and we serve our senior populations. And I don't know that this, you don't need to answer it now, but it should be considered how much that exists elsewhere in the region, whereas you can dial a ride, or you can have, you live in Colfax or North Auburn, and you can call somebody up and pick a driver who will get you to the doctors and back. So I think that goes into that. But, and again, I first heard this attributed to you, James. So I think that was, and then I think what I heard you say in here, and I think it's important, Roseville has Game Day Express, first an alleged National Basketball Association team that's down here. But I think those buses are packed, and if you can add capacity, I think that helps with a fare box recovery. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for listening to me ramble.
Yeah, thank you, Director Habershell. I'm actually going to comment on your comment because I had one relative to that before we go to someone different. And I think as part of looking at, where cuts need to be made, we should also be strategically looking at where are there other riders that maybe we aren't capturing that can help the system. And I think what Director Habershell shared is exactly that kind of thing. I know it doesn't work in all circumstances, but just kind of an example from my experience, the last 2 days, I've been down here for a conference that goes late into the evening, and I've chosen to take Yuba Sutter Transit down in the morning, Uber back in the evening. I know BCAG, which is the Butte County Association of Governments, has been looking at starting a bus service from Chico to downtown Sacramento, very high frequency, with stops in Yuba and Marysville and Plumas Lake. And I asked the residents in my community, how many of you would be interested in taking a transit service that operated in the evening with approximately hour frequency to downtown Sacramento for things like dinner and games and concert and things like that? And I was actually shocked at how many people said they would be interested in a service like that. So doesn't mean they'll actually ride the bus, but they at least expressed interest. And so we need to be thinking about those kinds of things, where they make financial sense and where there appears to be high interest levels. I mean, I think we can increase ridership by kind of thinking outside the box, especially since, post-COVID, it seems like the drop in transit usage is really related predominantly to people not going to the office, right, a lot. And so if that's the case, where would people use transit maybe? And, and we can look at that. So Director Branscombe.
Thank you. First, a quick comment on something Nathan said. Nathan said that electric buses are more expensive. That is one of the great understatements of the day. My understanding is that an electric bus costs 3x, at least 3x the cost of a regular bus. 2.5, okay, 2.5x. We'll do 2.5. But then you have to buy 2 of them to replace, so it's 5x. So relief from CARB is absolutely essential. I'm glad to see that's in the works. Now, management, SACRT management, I think it was earlier this week, presented a new budget, and it looks like it's pretty much the same as last year's, and okay. But then the analysis done by staff, I guess, or HDR, whoever, projected that the 28 deficit, fiscal 28 deficit, which would be presumably after 125 dries up, would be only 25 million. When isn't I think the current year 125 money is about 45 million, 50 million, in that range. So that means they're probably converting some capital money to operations. And the concern there is that in order to protect today, you could be creating serious problems 3 to 5 years out. And I bow my head to anyone on a transit board. It is a tough problem right now. The problem is that if you do something like that, you could end up with a much worse problem a few years downstream. And you spoke to the Gordian knot, Director Hume. You can get to a point where you have to make changes, and you'll be in a position where everything you do, if it isn't brutal, it won't be enough. Right. And what a tough problem. Management, you got to make sure your management team's tough enough. If this was a commercial operation, the board would replace senior management and call in turnaround people. But it's not that kind of thing because you don't have investors worried about it. No, and the users matter, and you have to take care of them. But how far can you go? How far can you go? I'm just worried that the current approach, where there's clearly going to be some conversion of capital money to operating money, and there will be an increased conversion, and those deficits that you see out there in the future are probably deeper deficits than what are being projected. Those may be very optimistic, and if they are, you could have a real huge problem within just 3 years. And so again, board members, management are in a difficult position. I just hope they worry enough about the future, because today you can solve today and put off the problem, but it's going to come and bite you in just a short period of time. And I think a shorter period of time than is forecast by the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Branscombe. We are getting a little short on time, so if people could try to keep their comments as brief as possible. We're going to go to Director Schaefer next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I kind of understand. I when you talked about the strategy, without a strategy, I think if you'd added a regional strategy, proceeding without a regional strategy would have been a little bit more conducive to the point you're trying to make. I think the individual operators should be responsible for optimizing their service levels and trimming budgets and that sort of thing. Certainly, I think SACOG could be, because we all are meeting here, SACOG certainly could facilitate that might be in a good position to that. But I would say that the individual operators really are the key players here. And they're the ones that really need to look at what their service levels are, see where they could cut some, I hate the word cuts, but optimize is a much better way to look at it. And they need to do that. It's not up to SACOG to dictate to them where they need to make the cuts. It's up to the individual operators to create that function. So that's my comment.
Great, thank you. Director Karichi, any quick
Quick.
comments?
I know it's hard for me, but it'll be quick. I made this comment once. I don't know if it was in here or in a committee meeting. One of the challenges is, and we have these vulnerable populations, no one's suggesting we cast them off or do anything like that. My concern is that, and I've seen this happen in other public agencies and working on budgets for things like publicly provided services, is sometimes you have to look at the instrument that you're trying to deliver the services with. And I think I mentioned, I think the RT guy, and I have nothing against RT. They're a perfectly good organization, I think. You might have to rethink the very thing that you want to use as your instrument to deliver the product. And is it going to work? Because you could just keep chipping away at it, but if it's not structured correctly, or if it's not structured the right way. And one of the challenging things I think is going to be looking at it with a whole new set of eyes. And if you have all these needs and demands and populations you want to protect, is any of the transit agencies actually, as they're currently configured, ever going to do that, given the funding horizons? And I think if we're going to be bold about this, then the bold discussion is not whether you nibble over here or put something over there or do that, is looking at the organization and saying, and it might very well be that that's it. That's as good as it's going to get. But unless you're willing to look at that really fundamentally, we could just be rearranging deck chairs here. And I don't want that. Nobody wants that. Certainly the operators don't want that, I don't think. But that's the bold move. The bold move is really pulling back and saying, is this the right instrument to deliver the thing we need to make it work right? And I don't know the answer to that. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have time for probably two more and then public comment. So Director Hume.
Well, I was going to give another soliloquy so that Director Howdeshelt would feel like he was getting his money's worth in his tuition, but given that we're short on time here, I just want to address a couple of things that were said either as a part of a previous discussion or this discussion. The first is Director Kalichi is correct that SB 125 is the child with their finger in the dam. It is not a solution, and it is coming late after the problem has already built up behind the safeguard. And Director Kennedy is absolutely correct that in addition to the quandary that I mentioned relative to coverage and frequency, the other quandary that gets talked about in transit circles is our expectations based off of transportation mode or off of safety networks. And those are not exclusive, because Director Villegas and I were talking about that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so my one comment would be this, that as we look at the fiscal cliff that we are facing, that one, we don't get caught in comparison, because comparison is the thief of joy. And so you can say that electric buses are 3x regular buses, but running a network of autonomous EVs is cheaper than $140 million a mile of light rail, right? So there are things that we're going to get caught up if we're looking at X, Y, binary decisions. Which brings me to the other thing, which is if we look at this as service cuts, who it hurts, draconian decisions, et cetera, we're going to get caught in this, feedback loop that isn't going to go anywhere. I would like us to look at a service reimagining and whether or not we need to cling to old models, or whether we can accept the fact that you used to have a Kirby salesman walking door to door selling a very expensive, heavy piece of equipment that had to have someone operate it, that had to be dragged from room to room. Now we have Roombas that clean our floors while we're gone, and they adjust to when we move furniture, right? So these are the kinds of disruptions that I think we have to account for. We have to start planning for if we're really going to make our dollars go as far as they should. Thank you, Chair.
Great comments. Thank you, Director Hume. Director Maple, we'll finish with you.
There you go.
Thank you.
Branding it. I like it.
I have a Robo Rock that uses AI and I just love it. Just putting that out there. I will say one thing Director Hume and I have in common is we both have a great interest in autonomous vehicles and how they could possibly be used in transit. So I'm going to actually loop you into something else I'm doing. But I'm hoping, Chair, if you're okay with it, that perhaps because we happen to have the general manager of SACRT in the room here, that he can come up and maybe address, because I know we've had many questions and comments both in this presentation and the previous one. I'm sure he will be exceedingly brief, but if that's okay with you, I would like to cede my time to him.
It's absolutely okay. We're going to close board comment and move to public comment, and we'll invite Mr. Lee up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Maple. And I'm so grateful and appreciative. I just heard just about like 4 or 5 comments, and I'm so grateful you guys as a regional leaders putting lots of efforts and your attention and emphasis on the transit. And I, on behalf of lots of riders and this region, 2.5 million citizens, I just want to thank you. So I briefly summarized a couple comments you guys mentioned. First one is the efficiency and reimagining our service. I think we have been constantly seek efficiency, Euro County and other Euro Transit and everybody else. And for SACRT, we did a little bit research with our peers in California. Our bus and rail efficiency is about 20% or more better than our peers. So I just wanted to emphasize some facts. And also we have been very bold and thoughtful in terms of innovations. Lots of innovations we have done under our very tough and extraordinary board of directors for SACRT. For example, we were the first, one director mentioned about the microtransit, Uber type of service from U County to the downtown. We were the first and the largest transit agency built the microtransit programs 8 years ago. We set up line for 12 different zones in different cities, Central Sky and others. And within that, that zone, they can do whatever they want to do. It's just door-to-door service. Then lots of transit agencies across the industry followed that. However, we quickly find out the cost is very, very expensive because one ride cost about $100. So what we did, we privatized that. We changed our service to a private provider. They instantly reduced the service by 50%. So now every year we save about $8 million, and from now on. Now another thing, one board director mentioned about electric bus is way more expensive than the regular bus. Yeah, it's more, but it's about 1.4 times more, not 5 times more. I just want to clarify that. The reason for that is the electric bus, the longest range, the mileage is about 180 miles once you're charged. But for regular bus right now, CNG and others, it's about 280 to 300 miles. The primary reason, the cost is higher for electric bus is because the mileage, the length, once you're charged. So that's the primary cost. It's 1.5 times more expensive. So that's that. And another thing is SB 125. You guys may know this year, Bay Area major transit agencies face huge physical cliff issue. Then governor, thanks to his leadership, he gave 5 Bay Area, made the largest transit agency, $595 million loan to bridge the gap. San Diego Transit Agency, they increased the fare by 35% to the service fare. So industry-wide, nationwide, about more than half of the transit agencies are facing this issue. Well, in this region, we will face this issue, and we present the SB 125, the information to the consultant. They did a great job and put everything together. And this year we have a balanced budget, and it's about $300 million operating budget, $1.9 billion capital budget. When we gave the information to the consultant, there are a couple things we did not incorporate there. We try to be conservative. One is we did not touch our reserve. Secondly, we have a regularly $50 million, whatever, flexible funding, not specifically operating, not specifically capital, but we can make that flexible. Right now, in the last 5 years, we used that $50 million to the capital projects. And the last 5 years alone, we invest about $1 billion in our light rail modernization and expansion. Our light rail system is the backbone of the public transit system of this region. And we were able to secure close to $800 million from federal, state, and local and regional, thanks to James' leadership. SACOG, provide lots of support on this. So we have a whole bunch of, we have 100 capital projects and about $6 billion portfolio. And what we plan to do in the future, we probably need to slow down the capital expenditures and then try to allocate funding to the operating. And also, I think there are a group of citizens are trying to do the citizen initiative sales tax measure, and the polling results showed 62% approval rating in the city of Sacramento. So they are doing that right now. I cannot get involved in that, but my board members as elected officials, they can talk more about that. So, and there's a lot of things, Director Hume and Kennedy, they always encourage us to be more, reimagine business. And especially, Director Hume said, can we do autonomous buses, whatever? Yes, we thought about that a lot. We would like to do that, but right now, the law is not allowing us to do that, and the buses are not there yet. But what we did is we private. Okay, just one more point. We privatized lots of our business. For example, our paratransit service is extremely, expensive for anybody. We actually privatized about 30% before. Now we want 45%. You guys know how difficult to work with unions to allow us to privatize that part of the service. Because of the wonderful partnership we built, they allow us to do that. So that being said, there are lots of questions I didn't, or whatever comments I did not know. So I just want to comment a little bit on this. Thank you for your time. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. So we're going to continue and just make sure there's no additional public comment on this item before we move on. We're quickly running out of time for the meeting. So I do apologize for board members that have additional comments and questions for staff. I would ask that you please just provide them to James or to Christina Svensk. You can just call them or email them to them, and they can be addressed during our next board meeting. So I do apologize for that. I know it's a really important topic and everyone wants to make sure that their input is heard. And so I apologize that we're not able to do all that here today. So are there any additional public comments, Claire?
There's no other public comment.
Okay, so then it's actually time for us to adjourn into closed session. And so we'll wait a few minutes while the public and staff exit the room and we stop the recording. So if you need to get a drink or hit the restroom, you probably have 2 or 3 minutes to do that real quick.
More general, but yeah, it's, well, yeah, it's well, the whole county's only got 26,000 people, and I forget the number. It's pretty sad. It is. I work my ass off getting them money. What they call it. What they call it.
Great, we're back in open session as the SACOG board, and there is nothing to report. So as we move into chair's report, board members' reports, and executive director's report, I have one thing. Chair Gallardo asked me to announce that we received a certificate of special congressional recognition from Congresswoman Matsui's office for the award we received in April from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. As a reminder, we received this a Community Impact Award for what we've done in inclusive long-range planning and strengthening economic opportunity across the region. So it's up here if anyone wants to check it out. So with that, James, we'll go to you, and then we'll ask if there's any board comments after that.
I'll make it short. I have my update that I hope you all are getting in your inbox the day before every board meeting. If you're not, let me know. The one thing I will say was referenced earlier, the House Transportation Committee in Congress is marking up federal transportation bill. So your attendance at Cap to Cap this year was incredibly timely. We'll keep you all updated. We will have an analysis of the bill and what it means. I know many of you have also been working on the Basics Act, which is the marker bill, the so-called marker bill that a lot of the local government coalitions and including our trade associations have really been pushing. It seems like some elements of that have found its way into the draft bill that is currently being marked up in the committee, but that still has a long way to go. Current law expires September 30th. So we'll have a lot more detail for what it all means. But I will say our congressional delegation and Congressman Kiley in particular has been very helpful because he is our rep on the House T&I committee. So I'll conclude it there.
Great, thank you. Any additional board comments? Yes.
I'll be brief. I just want to say, in case you guys didn't notice, yesterday in our CARTA board meeting, we hired and approved the contract of our first executive director. If you don't know who that is, we offered and accepted, and Kathleen Aziz is now the first executive director for CARTA. We're very excited about it. It was a number of months and a nationwide search, and Kathleen will start with us at the beginning of August.
Awesome,
Thanks.
thank you for sharing that.
Mr. Chair, just briefly. Yeah, I'd like to recommend, I know you're sitting in today, but I'd like to recommend if the board's willing to entertain a standing item in whatever form we decide on the agenda, either as a receive and file or a very brief update on the status of the CARTA efforts. Now that we have an executive director on board, I think it's critical to what we as a body are doing. And things are moving very quickly. And I think it's important that we all know precisely the machinations of the Joint Powers Authority that we established here a couple of years ago and how much we've done thus far. And things are going to move very quickly. So I feel we need to formalize a space for that information to get to all of us on a regular basis.
I think that's a great idea as a receive and file. We can confirm with Chair Gallardo that she's okay with that. And then if there's anything kind of super important or newsworthy, then we can also pull it off that and have a presentation on it. So
Just a
anything else?
point of clarification.
Yes.
With the hiring of the new executive director, who will be doing my favorite subject, mobility zones?
We will have to get back to you on that. If you didn't catch that, that's Kathleen Aziz has been your SACOG staff person. She's led a lot of the efforts from SACOG side on tolling, but also mobility zones and made many other presentations. And so the CARTA board has selected her to be the next executive director. So we'll let you know. We've got a great staff, as you know. So.
I'll be happy to serve on the interview.
Okay, well, seeing no more board comments, just a reminder, our next board meeting is Thursday, June 18th at 10 a.m. at Placerville Town Hall. And we're going to transition to the lunch meeting for the transit MOU. So if you serve as a board member on a transit agency, you're requested to stick around and have some lunch and participate in that meeting. Others are, of course, welcome to stay, but if you'd like to, I'm sure you probably have other things to do, you're welcome to do that as well. So with that, are we ready to move into that? We take we don't need a recess or anything.
We have 12 minutes.
you're welcome to recess for
Oh, no.
5-10 minutes and then convene in that other meeting.
Okay, so 10 minutes at noon? How's that work? Or is that too long?
Doing
5?
five,
Okay.
and then we can get you out of here sooner, so.
Okay, let's do,
you get- grab your lunch
let's
and-
do 11:55.
Kennedy 5.
Okay, Kennedy 5, Kennedy 5.
Kennedy 5-on-3.
This is a well-attended lunch. It's Transit Day at SACOG. It's an exciting day. Okay, while the rest of the folks are getting their lunches, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Appreciate all the conversation that we've had so far today. This is a really important topic for transit. So we're going to continue the conversation today and give an update of where we are at in terms of some really important work we've been doing related to our MOU, which is between SACOG and all of the transit operators. So we're going to start with a little history and then kind of go through what we've been doing and where we're at and what our next steps are. But before we get into it, I do want to use this as an opportunity. Oh, there she is, to introduce Susanna Beaumont. Susanna is our new principal planner as of maybe a month or two now, joining us to lead the transit program work that we have here at SACOG. So she's still getting up to speed, but I wanted to just, let everybody see her and know that she's here and is a good resource for everyone. She joins us from SFMTA. And before that, she was in Nevada at the Southern Nevada RTC, and before that at Fairfield Transit. So brings a lot of good experience, and we're really excited to have her. So Welcome to SACOG. And Director Havishel, you have a...
Your PowerPoint, I apologize if it's somewhere on the SACOG webpage and I haven't found it yet.
I don't know. That's a very good
Thank you.
question that I can't answer.
We will send it out though. After.
Yeah, we can send out. So, all right. So again, thank you. We do have representation from our transit partners here today, as well as board members that sit on the transit board. So I think this will be a really good, insightful discussion, hopefully, for everybody. So as I mentioned today, we're just going to provide a high-level overview of what the MOU structure is in our region, talk a little bit about why we're updating it, and what exactly we're updating, and then talk a little bit about some of the discussions that we've been having about the funding administration, federal FTA funding. So just a quick overview and reminder. So federal funding flows through an urbanized area, or UZA. And in our region, there's 4 UZAs, Sacramento, Yuba City, Woodland, and Davis. And the biggest one primarily is Sacramento UZA, which isn't a surprise. And there's multiple operators. So Placer County Transit, El Dorado Transit, obviously SAC-RT, YOLO TD. They all provide service within what is considered the Sacramento UZA. So in general, we get about $60 million per year in funding from the federal administration for transit. And you can see the sources there on the far right, 5307, 5339, 5337, and 5340. So that 5337 funding, that is for rail. So that pretty much just goes to SAC-RT because it is very explicit on the mode that it can be used on. So 5307, 5339, and 5340 all make up what we administer through our FTA formula allocation. So you just approved a discretionary share allocation last month. That's part of this. So we do a formula portion, and we do historically have done a discretionary portion. So that's what makes up that funding. The 5307 and 39 is capital, and some can be used for operating. And the 5340 is treated like 5307. It's just a different number because it is
not based on anything that has to do with any kind of operator or service. It is strictly based on population of the region and kind of like how it compares in California. So it's kind of a different source, but treated like one of the others. So as I mentioned, served by multiple transit agencies. You can see them all here. This is really important from a regional perspective. They all connect here in Sacramento. So as we just talked about in the last discussion, you know, the regional, even though our SB 125 discussion is on the 4 counties and in a smaller set of operators, it's really important for us to continue to look at all of our services together as a region because they do link up. People do ride Placer County Transit or El Dorado County Transit into downtown Sacramento and then transfer into Sacramento services. So we do really need to look at this from a regional perspective as we move forward. So the purpose of our transit MOU that exists now is really about defining roles and responsibilities between the MPO and the transit operators to support how we administer funding that we receive from the Federal Transit Administration. It talks a lot about regional governance and coordination between all of the agencies. It helps to really guide some of the planning and funding and oversight activities that are required when we use these funds. And then it also provides a forum for collaboration and accountability across the region. So there's a lot of really important aspects to this. And it essentially, if you boil down to it, the biggest function that it does is it defines how we put out that federal funding. So right now we have a formula for earned share, and we have some very specifics about a discretionary program, which is competitive. The board had made a decision that 88% of the funding will go out via formula and 12% is reserved for competitive. So these are the types of things that the MOU really dictates and sort of sets in stone. So a little bit more about this. So on the coordination side, you know, it does facilitate our ability to help with long and short range planning with our various agencies and data sharing. So another thing that we do is we hold a license to Remix, which is an important tool, data tool that our partners can use for transit planning and generating data. We hold that contract and we provide that service to our partners, and things like that are included in the MOU. And then obviously, as I mentioned on the federal funding side, it really helps us understand how we allocate out the funding, what the roles and responsibilities are between what is called a designated recipient and the transit agencies that receive the funds, and other things related to grant administration. So why are we updating this MOU? There's a number of reasons why. The current MOU was developed back in 2015. So it is over 10 years old. A lot has changed since then. It's very outdated in terms of the agencies that are actually named in the MOU. We need to update that. And just generally conditions in the environment from a planning perspective, but also from a funding perspective have changed. So we need to clarify some of the coordination structures as well. We typically have had what's called the Transit Coordinating Committee. Through this process of talking about updating the MOU, we've also now created what's called the TCEC, which is the Transit Coordinating Executive Committee. This is where we get the executives of each of the transit agencies together to have real substantive policy discussions about funding and other things that are happening in the region, which is something we didn't really do before. So we're trying to better define how we all work together and how we make decisions together collaboratively as a region. One of the really big things is federal recertification. So in our last recertification, it was actually noted as a finding that we needed to update our MOU. And so we want to make sure that we are doing that before our next recertification, which I believe is next year. So our goal is to try to get through this process by the end of the year so we can really show the federal government that we've made not just progress on it, but we have actually completed that in the 3 years that we've had since the last recertification.
Mr. Chairman, on that point, can we get a copy of the recertification findings?
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And then the last bullet point again, the funding administration. I think there's a lot of not just the fact that there's different operators and the environment with the operators has changed, but the funding has changed too, and the needs of our operators have changed too. So we are looking at doing a different way to allocate and administer out the federal funds that we get. There's another really interesting thing that's come out of this conversation, and I'm going to try not to go too deep into this, but what's really interesting is that right now we have one designated recipient, which at the highest level, you can kind of talk about it like federal funding from FTA flows to the designated recipient, and the designated recipient then kind of flows out the funding to SACOG and to the other agencies. So there is a sort of a middleman kind of with some of the funding. Right now, that is Sacramento Regional Transit. And historically, that has been Sacramento Regional Transit. We have received some comments and had really good discussions with all of the operators on expanding that out to have a second designated recipient, and that designated recipient being SACOG. There's a lot of reasons for this that have been discussed during these meetings, but I think the important thing is that that is something we've actually had very, I think, productive discussions on that have come to, everyone has kind of come to consensus on that to agree that this is a really good path for us. I think one of the main reasons that we're hearing for this is inherently the operators in the region from SAC-RT to SET Link, they do not necessarily compare in the types of needs that they have and the level of funding that they receive. Doing this would allow for a lot of flexibility for the smaller operators that they might need that maybe SAC-RT doesn't need. And so the way this would work is their funding would flow to both of us, and we would administer out the funding specifically to the small operators, and SAC-RT would be able to kind of be responsible for their funding that's established through a formula. So that's one thing that has kind of been discussed, and we're starting to look at the process of that. Obviously, this is something that will come to the boards and we'll all have to discuss a lot more, but it is something that we have heard a lot of support for. So we want to move forward with that. And then again, we would like to look at how we're allocating the funding out and do something different. And that's where we're kind of at in the conversations.
Christina, would that be sort of like a CARTA model that you're looking at? Or if you're, CARTA has like maps, I think, in ex officio. I mean, is that what you're thinking about?
No, it's just a designation from the FTA. So it just says here, you get the money and you administer it out, but there's no additional structure to it that requires any kind of extra decision.
Sorry, that'd be, my question was, this joint sharing of the DR, right? Would that be sort of like a CARTA model? Or?
No.
Oh, because I was looking forward to getting on the SAC-RT board as a transit agency
It
representative.
would require coordination between SACOG and SAC-RT, which already happens in the administration of the funding, but it doesn't result in any more. FTA provides funding via a specific formula that they come up with to our region. Then the second layer of it is us as a region coming up with a formula of how we distribute it out. That's where we're at in discussions right now. But what comes to us, we don't really have a part in.
Dr. Hume?
Thank you, Chair. Christina, I know that with the designated recipient designation comes great obligation from a fiduciary standpoint relative to the funds that are expended. And so if this dual model were taken on, then would SACOG themselves be fiscally responsible or liable, or would that pass through to the smaller operator?
That's part of the discussion that we have right now. We're starting to estimate maybe some administrative costs that we may have to take on that we would have to fund through the funding that comes through. Some really important things, though, that we have established that if we were to do this, for example, we would not take on any subrecipients. Subrecipient monitoring takes up a lot of resources, both staff time and funding, to make sure that you're in compliance. That is something that we just aren't as an agency equipped to do. And so we've been very transparent that that is something that we couldn't do. So we're minimizing some of the responsibility or some of the risk in that way, but there's a slide that shows the responsibilities later, and it might help with the discussion.
So yes, and on what you just said, but specific to my question, I wasn't asking about off the top administration. I was talking about in the case of a need for repayment of expended funds. Is that SACOG's responsibility, or would that flow through?
If they're a direct
recipient. If they're a direct recipient, it would be their responsibility.
I'm speaking for those agencies that would be under the umbrella of SACOG being a fellow designated recipient.
They're not designated recipients. They're direct recipients, which just allows them to receive funding. So there's two different categories. There's designated, who says, FTA, we're going to give you the money. Direct recipients are then just eligible to receive federal funding directly without having to be a subrecipient of someone else that has that designation. I know it's very confusing.
It is because the slide says desired to have SACOG
Yes.
and SACRT
Yes. We
as the
would-
two designated recipients.
Yes.
I don't know if this would help. So under the model SACOG proposed to all of us operators, everyone else would have to be a direct recipient. As a direct recipient, you have a direct relationship with FTA. They directly give you the money. They directly audit you. If there's an issue, you directly pay it back. It doesn't go, all they do is a planning and programming. The fiscal relationship is directly between a direct recipient and FTA. Designated recipient is in that case only like planning and programming to make sure you spent it according to how it was planned and programmed, but it's not the financial responsibility is then tied with the direct recipient and FTA directly.
So if there's
So any
a-
repayment is the two agencies together.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was the question I was asking. Thank you.
Director Andrietta.
Christina, quick question. Is there a lot of bureaucracy involved in changing the designated recipient from one entity to two? I mean, obviously you're talking about it, so it's allowed, but what's the process of changing that? A lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, a lot of walls?
That's a really good question, and that's what we're starting to look into now. So actually, much of it sits with the state, and you need to get the governor and the governor's office to sign off on it and say, yes, we're okay with that. It's really less about the federal government and more about the state. So we've talked with FTA about it, but we're starting to talk with our folks about the state portion of that process. And we recognize it could take a really long time too, so.
Just a very short clarification. Right now, SACOG is a designated recipient. As a designated recipient, we have two responsibilities. One, allocate all the fundings by coordinating with SACOG and others in this UCA. Secondly, responsible for all compliance related issues. The past MOU, we all agreed to give the funding allocation authority to SACOG. And right now, FTA said, well, you guys SACOG cannot do that because that's your responsibility. Then we discussed that. Great strategy from SACOG together, give it a wonderful coordination. Now, Roseville come to the party to propose dual proposal. And I immediately enforced that because the reason for that is the small operators, they board members are not sitting in SACOG board. So to be fair, it would be good for SACOG to be the DR for the small operators because all small operators, board members are sitting in the SACOG board. So that is what happened.
Yep.
Henry took the words out of my mouth. And then to Bruce's question, that's why we don't have representation on the SACRT board. And when all of our funding flows through the SACRT board, we don't have any ability to influence those decisions.
Dr. Schaefer? Thank you, Chair. I hear little bits and pieces of this, but I want to put this all together and make it clear. So for a direct recipient, does SACOG have administrative responsibility or not?
Can you repeat that question?
What's that?
Can you repeat your question?
Sure. With regard to, like I said, I'm hearing little bits and pieces here, but I want to put it all together. And for somebody who's receiving a direct recipient from FTA, does SACOG have administrative responsibilities?
Yes, we do, in terms of administering the grant
For a
funding.
direct recipient, what does that mean? What accountability is going through SACOG offer if it's a direct recipient from FTA? It sounds like they get the money and then SACOG is, but I heard somebody else say, well, FTA is responsible for auditing and making sure that the money is spent the way it's supposed to be spent. So which is it? Is SACOG have responsibility to make sure the money gets spent when it's a direct recipient?
Shoot, it's on a slide in a few, but we have some. So correct, if you are receiving the funding, and any of the operators here can definitely elaborate on this because they go through this and we don't necessarily. But if you are a direct recipient of FTA funding, you have to go through an audit process. What is it, every 3 years, triennial audit. You are responsible there to be able to show that you are being good stewards of the funding and doing what you're supposed to be doing. There is monitoring that is required with that. If there are sub-recipients, so if you are not a direct recipient, you're a sub-recipient, the direct recipient is then responsible for all the sub-recipient monitoring and extra kind of hoops and requirements to make sure that those funds are being used properly, even if it isn't your agency. Us as an MPO or us as a designated recipient would have to make sure that our direct recipients are going through the processes, but we are not necessarily being audited in the same way as they are being audited for the triennial reviews for the funding that they directly receive.
So even though they're a direct recipient, it still comes through SACOG.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
The goal here is to have all of the non-SACRT operators be direct recipients, because that is less work than if they're subrecipients.
And currently there's 2 operators in the region that are not direct recipients. It's Paratransit Inc. and Eldorado Transit. And we've been talking with both of them, and I think they're both in different, and SCT Link. Sorry, there's 3. And we've been talking with them about the process that it be required to become a direct recipient.
And on behalf of Paratransit, I can let you know we're probably a week out. They're actually setting up all of our access and giving us passwords as we speak.
So the second bullet there, we've talked a lot about the funding, how it's allocated. So this is what we're starting to have big conversations in our next meeting with the transit operators about how we are going to actually administer the funding. So as I mentioned, if we do the 2 designated recipient model, this is how the funding would basically flow. FTA would split depending on how we decide. We would split the funding that comes from the FTA between SACOG and Sacramento Regional Transit. From there, we would suballocate the funding that we get to the small operators. And again, that would be from some agreed upon formula that we haven't had the conversations about yet. This is all where we're at right now. So it spares SACRT from going through a secondary formula situation, right? They would have the first layer of formula that helps determine what goes to SACOG and what goes to RT, and then a whole nother process for how we work with the small operators to distribute that funding. So this, I won't go through all of this, but this will be a really good thing when we send out the presentation. This right now shows the responsibilities between a designated recipient and an MPO. And why this is important is that right now, the designated recipient, that's SACRT on the left, and the MPO, obviously SACOG on the right. There is a lot more responsibility related to becoming a designated recipient. And so if we become a second designated recipient, we will be doing all of those duties right there. The only one that doesn't really change or that is kind of different is right now, designated recipient does not recommend projects for funding, but the MPO does. So we will retain that because we are still the MPO. We will just be serving both of these duties, checking off all of these. So hopefully the subrecipient eligibility piece, as you see, and some of the things related to subrecipients below that, if we don't have subrecipients, we won't really need to be worrying too much about those. So some upcoming milestones, as I mentioned, we're starting the discussions about formula and whether or not we continue to have a competitive process and what that would look like. That's where we're at right now. We plan to have our next meeting in June. We just had one last month where we kind of started the discussion and opened up the door to think about some strategies that we could maybe move forward with. Our goal is to have something, as I mentioned, done by the end of the year. So hopefully by fall, we will have an MOU or a series of MOUs to have adopted by the governing bodies. And I say series of MOUs because if we do become another designated recipient for the region, we likely will have to have, we have the planning MOU, which kind of encompasses everything except the funding. Then we will have a funding MOU for the SAC-UZA. That will look a little different between, for SAC-RT, we will have to then have a second one or a third one with the small operators because we will have a whole separate process that is being determined through that. So there will be 3 that we will be working on. I think a lot of what was in the last MOU related to the planning seems to be still relevant. I don't think we have as much discussion about those as having some issues with that. I think we'll tweak things for sure. But the biggest, most substantive conversation is on the formula and how we distribute out the funding. So that's what we hope to spend the summer on, coming up with some ideas and concepts there that we can all agree on, and then have some MOUs in front of all of the boards by late fall so that we can wrap this up by the end of the year and show FTA that we've done what they've asked and can start moving because we have 2026 funding that has already started to be published of what those dollars are for FTA for the region. We'll have 2027 next year. So we really want to get this in motion and start to be able to put out the funding that is becoming available to our region. So with that, would love to open this up for a quick discussion with the board members and operators.
Director Kennedy?
Thank you, Chair. No questions. I just want to make a comment that I was the chair of both SACOG and RT when this issue came up and we started having, these discussions. And I just want to give huge credit to staff of all of the agencies and all of the agencies that have been involved in these conversations, because what was a couple of years ago, a food fight is now lunch. And I mean, it's come a long way and really, really appreciate all the hard work.
Mr. Chair, can you give us a breakdown between what formulaic and discretion? Is it discretionary?
Yeah. So right now, of the funding that comes to our region from FTA, the board determined that 88% of that total will go out via formula. The formula that we use is what's called the earned share. And this is something that takes into account operating statistics and population, basically, of all of the regions of the operators within the SAC-UZA. That is how we distribute out the formula. The discretionary portion is the competitive, historically. The last thing that you guys just adopted is an anomaly, and it was very different. But typically, we hold a competitive process for the remaining 12% of funds that looks at needs, alignment with regional goals, blueprint, things like that. And by and large, it's going out to capital projects in the region. So bus purchases, facility upgrades, things like that. I think Paratransit's used it for mode shift programs or mobility management programs in the past. So that's how it's currently done. We can look and get you the numbers of how it's actually broken down for each of the operators if you'd like.
And this is when I miss Director Branscombe. I think he asked at a meeting sometime in the last year, memory's clouded, what the term unlinked trip means. Is that part of the metrics?
I don't know if it's explicitly unlinked trips that we use for the ridership.
Trip? Is it one way? Not when I get on my e-bike and go to the transit.
That's trip chaining. Yeah.
Standardized measurement for one person stepping on a bus one time, it's unlinked passenger.
Thank you. And what I appreciate about Director Hume is that he saves me a lot of money in therapy.
Any other comments or questions? I think if I may, Christina's done a great job outlining all of this, and please, all the operators are here. So weigh in, chime in here. We just mentioned that the co-designated recipient is sort of like the first hurdle to get over. And we appreciate all the SACOG board questions about what does that actually mean, because we have the same questions. which is why we're trying to get everybody into direct recipient status. That'll make it a lot easier. The next big thing is, I know you all appreciate, is the funding, right? And so what's an appropriate and fair division of the funding? And I would say from a SACOG perspective, like formula is it, and we want certainty, right? And the money that comes. The 12% that has been competitive in the past is helpful to mid-sized and smaller operators because your costs are lumpy. And so they will come in and compete for, hey, I've got a big need right now. And so I can kind of like overperform my share, right, of what would have been formula. And so I'm just trying to put it on the table in a way that I think is where we stand. That's a little bit of where we're at right now in terms of what's sort of a fair way to split up the funds, and an acknowledgement that some of the smaller operators are going to have these lumpy costs that when you're a small operator are very lumpy, right? And you may not actually feel like you're going to get all of that by a formula. So that's kind of, is that
That's great.
okay to say? Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I just want to put I think a little bit of a finer point, since we have the opportunity to address you all, and appreciate you all for sticking around. There is FTA wanted us to do this because that MOU needed to be updated, but there are other priorities at play. And one of the ones that I just want to name is, it's not just about federal versus discretionary, or formula versus discretionary. It's also, what's my share? And I think I feel confident saying that on behalf of the small operators, we're comfortable with the way the shares are split now and have been in the MOU that's been in place for over a decade. We are not hearing that from RT. RT believes that they are subsidizing us and they want a bigger share of that money going forward. And that is a fundamental challenge that we are going to have to get over, and we're not going to solve it today. But, we are all facing a fiscal cliff. You heard a lot about it today. And the question is, are we going to try to solve that fiscal cliff by stealing money from each other? And I would argue that that is not the path forward, and that is not the most efficient way for us to spend our time, is to try to grab money from each other, but rather to focus on how do we do all the things that we talked about during the board meeting today. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off it. I'm sure Henry would have some thoughts on that as well. Thank you.
Rebuttal, is that how this works?
Your ideal world, because the federal money is based on formula, based on what each individual transit agency contribute. So they use that formula to allocate to the entire region. Majority, or at least 1.5 of the transit agencies use that federal formula, whatever you got, whatever you contribute, to allocate individual transit agencies. I mean, SACOG region, promote collaboration. Ideal world would be, we know what federal formula is for each individual transit agency. However, we need to collaborate. We need to help each other. So we put a discretionary fund aside, 5%, 12%, whatever, then use that money to help each other. In this year, this small agency needs a little bit more money, a lot year, whatever. But in 5-year or 10-year term, to equal that out based on that formula or percentage. SACOG board set up a MOU subcommittee, 3 or 4 board members. Those board members made the decision. What those board members, there's a criteria. One, those board members will not be in SACOG board. And second, those board members will not be in STA board, Sacramento Transportation Authority board. So they can have objective opinions. And so basically, SACOG team, management, decent, and update that subcommittee. Then we get direction from them. Then we come to talk to our peers and in this region. So then we will have some discussions about that. And I did not attend majority of the meetings, so I really don't know what you guys talk about autumn. But again, I just generally speaking, that's what the situation.
I was just going to add, I know it came up a little bit. I thought it might be interesting too on how the smaller operators got to the idea of SACOG being the DR too. we did some research. So typically, in areas where there's more than one operator, the MPO is the designated recipient. There are a handful of places where it's the operator. They generally are urban areas where there's only one operator, or there is a very small operator, but it's very limited in scope. And when we went back and looked, the current designation in Sacramento goes from when SACRT was the agency in the Sacramento urbanized area. Yolo hadn't fallen in, Roseville hadn't followed in, and over time, more agencies fell into the urban area as it grew and it wasn't revisited. There are several places in the state where the dual has emerged and is kind of reflective of this. And I think it's worth saying that there are other places in the state where the current relationship is there. And if you look at them, they don't tend to be the healthiest relationships around operators. San Joaquin County is set up the way we are. And historically, you get kind of this who governs which agencies in charge. So that was something we looked at. And a lot of it comes to about representation, process. I think a lot of the MPO relationship is because there's a planning tie between how you use all your funds. And so I think that's why a lot of the MPOs in the state, but I thought that was important for this, is that when we looked at that, that actually is the model for most places in California. And it wasn't how Sacramento was. So when we looked at it, is there a place that's maybe more representative of how everyone else does that goes into the bigger picture of the funding we're trying to do. And so that was the model we put forward.
I don't know how much of the meeting we have left, but I just want to say how productive and fruitful I think it is to have everyone in the room talking about it in front of each other and actually, airing dirty laundry if it needs to, but also working on what is a more sustainable path forward. And so I just commend this meeting. I think it was a very good idea to convene and bring it together.
I just have a question on, not about our faith, because I think we have good faith, but what happens if we don't make a determination and a decision in the timeline that we're given?
I don't necessarily know if there's any distinct consequences other than we might have another finding in recertification if we haven't, although we are showing some sort of progress to it. But in terms of the funding actually being distributed, I think the default would be to continue using the existing process that we have until there's an agreement that's made. And we're having those discussions as well. That's part of it.
And you stated it better than I asked it, so thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
I'll just add on one thought, which is, again, we don't know exactly what would happen, but typically in this federal certification process, if you have repeat findings, you're likely subject to a corrective action, in which case the federal government could come in and mandate essentially what they want done. So there is a risk to funding for not complying with what they want. So we'll have to either show reasonable progress or completely, comply with a new MOU, which again, to be clear, the FTA is not dictating how the funding is allocated. They just say you have to have a local agreement on what that funding agreement contains.
And I'll just say, as your SACOG executive director, I really believe that we have to hit this timeline. It may not be severe consequences, but I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 18 months, as is noted by Director Hume. Honestly, it's the transit operators, and Henry and I have sort of removed ourselves from a lot of those discussions, but this group as well, those of you on the SACOG board, this is pretty unique that 16 of you also represent transit agencies. So we want to come back to you for this. We obviously want an MOU that's fair, right? That everybody feels like we can live with. We're probably not going to make everybody extremely happy, but that we can live with. And if we're going to do a co-DR, as was mentioned earlier, we have to get the state and the governor to sign off on this. And that, to me, gives us a clock of about 5 to 6 more months, while we actually have a very good relationship with the California State Transportation Agency. I just don't know the next administration. None of us do, right? So I would say, yes, there's no absolute timeline, but I want to try to get a sense of urgency amongst all of you to figure this out this year, because we've made some really good progress. There clearly are still some really tough questions ahead on dividing up money. There always will be on that, but I don't think we can live with this MOU for a lot longer before we begin to feel a bit of the hurt.
So, I'm sorry. So I just want to make sure I understand the timeline associated with what we're trying to do, because I hear the sense of urgency and I hear about 5, 6 months. And I don't want to wait to 5 to 6 months. So what's going to be required of us over the next 5 to 6 months?
I
This
think
group.
it's a really good question. And I think outside of sometime in the fall, hopefully MOU's coming to be adopted by all the boards, I think we really need to think about how we want to continue to engage this group in the process, and continue to bring back updates and get some sort of response and direction and insight from all of you together in this room as we continue to develop it. One thing that we've been noodling on is, once we kind of come up with maybe a potential strategy for the formula aspect of it, or how the funding in general is going to flow, coming back, reconvening this group and being able to talk it through before we start to advance it to go to boards. I think we have really good productive discussions in this room, has been noted. And I think we need to build on that. So if that is something that this group is interested in, I think we can start to build into our timeline this specific set of people, in addition to then the individual board adoptions and where that comes into play there.
So I like everything you said, everything I heard. The thing that keeps confusing me is late fall.
Yeah.
And all those, it's not specific enough for me.
Okay.
I need it to be more direct as far as intentional, knowing when we're going to come back together, when we're going to make decisions in order to meet that timeline that we've already set.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I think we were intentionally vague here because we haven't had the next meeting yet with the operators on where we're going to start to have more in-depth discussions about the formula itself. I think that discussion will really dictate our understanding of how long it might take for us to get to a point where we have a formula that we know is going to go to boards. I would say a safe thing would be probably October or November, probably October, if we want to get this done by the end of the year. So in my head, that's kind of what I've been thinking, but I was hesitant to put it explicitly on.
Can I ask you a question? Would you find value in getting together sooner than that as this body of
Oh,
the
yeah, I was-
operators and the board members
Yeah.
for an update? Because we can make that happen just on the SACOG cycle. We're not meeting in July. We do meet in August. We're offsite in September. We meet again in October, which is probably what Christine was thinking of. So if you wanted a mid-term update, perhaps August, doing a similar thing here, would be a check-in point, okay?
Yeah, I was thinking August for the check-in, but October is when I was thinking it would go to boards. So we would need to have an interim check-in, and I was hopeful that whatever conversation we have with the operators in June would help us solidify what the next few months would look like.
Yeah, thank you. I think that'll be helpful. I think also be helpful, for me at least, is to better understand what kind of all the deal points are and what the progress is on all of those. Kind of hearing a lot about just the funding split today, but where everyone is in alignment and what that looks like. And then we can kind of drill into what that issue is. What I'm hearing, it sounds like it's just around the financial split of the 12%. I mean, is it fair to say that most people are in agreement with the co-DR model?
Yes, people are in agreement on the co-DR model. Everything outside of that is still very much up in the air.
Okay.
The
So
8812 may not even stand.
right, so I think that's the piece of like us coming into the game, not until August, if it's around a funding split, like it'd be nice to have that information and better understand where the organizations are and what proposals are out there or what it is. And, so we have clarity around what we're working with. Because right now it's just, right, these conversations have been happening for a while.
Yeah.
And I would like to know where people are, right? Like what the splits are, the proposals out there. I'm not saying today, but for us to dive into it and better understand, and then understand the work that we'll need to do as colleagues and conversations offline around how we move something forward. Because what I'm hearing loud and clear is that we don't want this to go past this timeline, right? And I think we'll need time to process through this.
One thing we can do is put together some good summaries after all of our meetings to distribute out to this group, so you can see the progress of the discussions and where things stand. But in addition to that, we'd be happy to provide kind of a much more detailed bulleted list of what we've done so far, where we're in agreement, where we still have a lot of work to do to just kind of set the stage for you. But then after our meetings, I'd be happy to continue to provide updates.
Okay, and then just my last question on the point you brought up earlier. So if it's common that the model is the MPO, is why hasn't that been switched for to remove, I'm not saying I'm proposing this, SACRT from that role overall. Like, why hasn't that been changed if that's what most jurisdictions do, is to have the MPO be the recipient?
I mean, it's kind of
I
never
think this
come
is
up.
the art of the possible right now for a co-DR. That would be my,
Got it.
that's,
No, I'm not
that's the
advocating that
path of
approach.
least
I was just
resistance, I
curious.
would
Yeah.
tell you.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
I just had a quick question, because I know we're chasing two timelines. We're chasing the timeline of the administration and then the timeline for the corrective action. Is there a reason, if there's consensus for the ODR, that couldn't come first so that it could go in? Because there's the off chance that if the governor says no, it would impact the MOU and have to change. Is there a reason we couldn't potentially tee up a decision like that?
I propose, James, even governor will not approve that, but SACOG would like to designate that type of DR responsibility to them to manage the small operators funding. I mean, we have a selfish reason for that. Each year, we spend over 300.
It just, yeah, it just made me think, well, since we're chasing timelines, if there's some consensus, can that get through? So because it kind of has its own piece that feeds in, but I don't know that the state's going to care so much about what we agree on how we split the federal share as much as is the state saying, well, would you be willing to designate SACOG into this role? Do they have to go together? Do we know?
I don't see a path. If you talk about the two levels of splits, you can't say that you're going to have two designated recipients without saying who is getting what and what responsibilities. And so we're trying to adopt a frame or outline a framework for the MOU that really creates the space for both possibilities, for not being designated by the governor and also having that designated in the future. But really, it has to be a total package.
Yeah, I want to pick up on Director Chapman's very excellent point. So we're really, feels like we're drifting away from the kumbaya moment that we had maybe 10, 15 minutes ago. In, when we get into the details, then there's more opportunity for adversarial versus advocacy positions. Are we talking about, so 60 million comes to the region, 12% of that is discretionary. So that's 8 million that's discretionary amongst all 6 regions?
Amongst the operators within the Sacramento UZA.
Right. And then, that gets your metrics that you talked about. So I appreciate you offering to get, put memos out and things like that, but I'm where Director Jennings is we could do this in the fall, right? It's not gonna get done the first time around, is it? So the earlier that we can take action on it, and if we really, and I assume that $8 million that's discretionary is split between the 6, and I'll just say the bigger the better, right? So no,
Currently, it's done in a competitive process, and SACRT is actually, because of how large they are, capped at $2 million a
so
year.
we're 6 million, right?
Mhm.
Amongst, okay. Anyway, it seems, yeah, I don't want to get too far away from the formula, the kumbaya moment. Because you've come a long way from when I first got a call that said Henry Lee wants to meet with you, and I said, yeah, okay, no. This is a very collaborative process. This reminds me of what SACOG did with the federal corrective action and the joint funding agreement. So I echo Director Professor Hume's comments that our staff is amazing in finding that collaborative aspect of this. So thank you very much.
Autumn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on an observation on some of these comments about what your role is in this, I will say that as staff, there are certain things that get above our pay grade. And one of them is when there's money on the line and there's high stakes. And so I, for one, would be an advocate for you all being more involved as we get into the home stretch here. We've been at it for 18 months. And as you can hear, there's a lot that is still unresolved. And so I will say, speaking for myself, I would welcome your participation because you all aren't busy enough.
Director Maple?
Thank you, Chair. And I'm really glad that we're at this point too. You know, from some of the conversations several months ago to where we are now, I think this is a really good place to be. I will say what would be helpful for the next conversation that includes whatever subsection of folks who will be there is having a, you know, a bullet point list or, you know, with clarity and I would say honesty about what the sticking points are so that we can work through those things, clear-eyed, understanding that, yeah, they may be really tough conversations. I can already anticipate a few. But I think that's the important work that needs to happen to get this done in the time frame that we want to do it. So I'm all in. Thanks.
If I could just real quick, just from the operator's perspective, I mean, it's going to come down to money. Maybe just putting it out there. We can have discussions about earned share and discretionary, which we can work together as a group. But the MOU is, as was stated earlier, works for the small operators. The funding allocation percentages work for the small operators. As long as SACRT is going to insist on getting more money at the expense of the small operators, that's where we're going to have the problem. That's where we're having the problem. So just as far as putting it out there, that's the big hiccup because the MOU is, as it currently is, the percentages, they work for us, for the small operators. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Anything else, Christina or board members? Or transit?
No, nothing
operators?
else from us, but
Okay.
appreciate all of the discussion.
Great. Well, we're going to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
The more we talk, the farther we get.